confirmation, so we are on and live. This meeting is being recorded and live broadcast by Amherst Media. Thank you, Amherst Media. First order of business is to approve minutes of November 25th. And these minutes have been sent to the committee prior to this meeting, but I will give everyone a moment to take a look again, just in case they have any edits or changes they would like to bring to attention. Ms. Spitzer?
I just wanted to make one clarifying comment. So there aren't page numbers, but one, two. So the bottom of the third page, second to last paragraph, where it's the conversation about the UMass Donahue Institute study, and maybe it's possible I wasn't clear, but I was bringing up North Village in consideration of the fact that those apartments, there's been in the press discussion of transitioning them from family housing to just straight up student housing, and that was why I was bringing up that concern.
Thank you. So we need to make those changes to the minutes. Any other comments or questions? I have a couple of comments and edits that I think need to be clarified. So one was around the stipend conversation that we had. Sorry, I'm just looking for this right now.
E.
Yeah, thank you, E. So the second paragraph, where it says Ms. Ordonez is not sure she can vote on this because she is leaving the committee. My comments actually were not about my leaving the committee, but rather that I was concerned about the budget where the stipends were coming from. So they are, they had been itemized this year for coming from the school budget, and I was stating that I would prefer that they come from the town budget. So just want to clarify that for the record, because it's actually a very important part of that conversation that we had. And then there was another place, sorry, bear with me, I read these earlier today and did not mark a copy. This is a conversation about, so the top of that same page, so item D, the first paragraph under item D, the paragraph, or the sentence rather, that starts, sometimes they must conceal things in warrants, such as out-of-district placements and student initials. The word conceal is a problematic word. I don't think that that's what you intended, Dr. Morris.
Thank you for catching that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, see if we could find a better word, because that's not what I remember you saying.
No, I think it's, now of course I'm struggling with what I said and a better word for it. But we're not able to disclose, but that's the opposite. That's not the right syntax for the sentence.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if, given, these changes, if it's possible for someone to go back and maybe rewatch the video and make these, because these feel like fairly substantive changes, if the committee's okay with that.
And I'll add also on E, I believe there were 2 policies that we reviewed, not just one.
Right.
But I don't have it in front of me to remind myself which were the letters.
Well, so I think it's BDB, and then it says BIB here, but there's no shift in, is that what you're?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The subhead says only 1 policy,
Right.
but it's 2. But the compensation is being discussed in both
Right.
paragraphs, as if it's in both policies, but it was only one of the policies. So
And there were 2
I'd
votes.
need to go back to my notes or watch the.
So,
So what I was going
yeah,
to suggest is that I can share the video link with CeeLo, so she can, now that those parts have been highlighted, so we can go back and come to the January meeting with those highlighted areas edited.
That would be
If
great.
the committee is
Yeah.
willing to.
Yeah,
can
I see
settle-
nodding heads here.
Okay.
Yeah, the minutes are part of our public record, so if the community or other, future school committee members or even the administration want to come back and find out what a committee discussed, these minutes have to be clear and they have to, reflect what was actually discussed. So I don't want to just let that go. And I appreciate the opportunity to come back and make those edits later on. Okay, so moving us along then, next item on the agenda is committee announcements. Does the committee have any announcements they would like to make? Mr. Demling?
So, since this is the last Amherst School Committee meeting for our chair, Anastasia, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for your service and to say that it's been a real honor to serve with you. I think of public service in general as selfless effort for the greater good, and I feel lucky to have seen you demonstrate this for many years without ever any desire for personal credit or recognition, only ever motivated by what's best for students. And so much of your effort has been outside the limelight. I think of it as like this iceberg situation where, many members of the community have seen your efforts on the surface, but the actual number of hours you've put in has been so much greater. And I can honestly say that I've never seen anyone work as hard as you have in a public service position. And I have great admiration and respect for your work ethic. So I think you should feel really good and really genuinely proud that your service will have a lasting positive impact on our district and our students, and that our schools and our town are better places because of it. So sincerely, thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you. Get some rest. And I look forward to hearing your 3 minutes at some point in the future.
It's a deal. Thank you, Mr. Demling. Thank you. It's also been a great pleasure working with you and the other committee members as well. I appreciate this. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Morris?
So the only thing I want to add is I'm not going to add to what Peter said on the specifics, but I also want to acknowledge that you got a little more than you bargained for in terms of your time in the committee with the town government. So I think it's been really helpful that you've stuck it out beyond your initial commitment, which was 3 years, to 3 years and roughly 3.5 years, would you say?
10 months.
Okay, there you go. Sorry, I apologize.
You're not counting, yeah.
But just, I think you've in my opinion, played a critical role in transitioning multiple school committees, because not just for Amherst, but from the other towns of the region. The turnovers, and you're sort of where, just when you started and when you're going off, you were able to be a real constant in supporting the district as school committee members have transitioned on and off through multiple years. You have institutional knowledge, and you'll be able to use that to, what I've seen from my vantage point is to orient not just staff, but also orient new members. And I think that's been really critical, because a lot's changed in the last 5 years, or 3.75 years, or however it's worked out in terms of the number. And so I just deeply appreciate your service. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. Thank you. Much appreciated. Okay, so I will move us along. Next item on the agenda is public comment. If anyone wishes to make a public comment. I see a shaking head. Okay. It is now 6:13. We had public comment listed for, or on the agenda for 6:05. So I am going to close public comment, seeing no one else here and no one in the public currently willing to make any comments. But if, with the committee's permission, if somebody were to come later on and wishes to make public comment, they are welcome to do so. Next item so I will close public comment. Next item on the agenda is the superintendent's update.
I'm going to do this one orally, and it'll be very brief. So just one follow-up is that after our last meeting, I had what I felt like was a very productive meeting with UMass and the town on the topic that we talked about in terms of where we are with the Donahue Institute study. And so I don't have anything formal to share, but I just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate the feedback I received at that meeting, and I was able to share that with both the representatives from the university as well as the town. So thank you. I found that topic very productive for me, which is, I got what I was looking for, I guess, in terms of direction. So thank you. This afternoon, snowed out yesterday, there was a group that met on the Crocker Farm study, looking at that building and potential expansions. They're reviewing the different responses that came in from a request for proposals. So I know Derek Shea is as well as Anthony Delaney, who's the procurement officer, both for the schools, but also for the town, as well as a community member. I think it was the three of them. I might be wrong by one, but I know Mr. Shea was on that. Was able to have that meeting today. I also was, because I was meeting with Mr. Shea on a different topic, got to see the beginning of a chorus concert at Crocker Farm, which was really neat, and it's always neat in the first one in the fall, because you have a number of students who this is their first chorus concert. So in addition to the wonderful job that I saw 5th and 6th grade students doing, just seeing 5-year-olds sort of amazed by these big kids who are singing their hearts out so bravely, something I would never have chosen to do as I was a 5th or 6th grader, mind you, so it was really nice to be there.
Dr. Morris, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just wondering if you could remind us what the date is for the pulling together the expansion study for Crocker Farm?
The date of...
For the RFP, just to...
Oh, so all the proposals came in, and this was to review the proposals that they had to, choose whether they're going to shortlist folks and then interview, I think in relatively short order, the people that group chooses to shortlist. So I think they'll be able to get the ball rolling very shortly on that.
So we should have a date, though, when that decision will be made?
Yes.
Do we have that, or?
I don't have it for you tonight, but I can email you that.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
No, that's a good
It's just
one.
important information, I think, for the committee to have.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Sorry
Absolutely.
to interrupt.
No. It's a good question. Last night, if we had the meeting, there was Mr. Shea and Ms. Smith, the principal and assistant principal at Crocker Farm. We're going to share an update of their school improvement plan and progress to date. They weren't able to make it tonight because it's the evening chorus concert, so they wanted me to publicly apologize, but I said, you need to be with the kids and the families tonight, and all the schools are gonna roll through in the next couple months, so we'll push that to January. But they apologized for that. Monday, we had a very productive meeting, in my opinion, of the Grade Span Advisory Group, and so Ms. McDonald and I are on that, as you know. And I think all the documents we produce, as well as agendas, are always updated on our website, so everything the group produces, even in draft form, it's a completely transparent process that way. And I think by the time we get together next time, and particularly in February, is my personal opinion, we'll have, I think, a full, robust report and information to share out. So that group is still working very hard, coming up with ideas, both around community engagement, the academic program, and also trying to figure out what a final report would look like that would communicate to the community where we are, the work that happened, and then the incredible amount of work that will go on after this particular group is done. And Ms. McDonald made a comment at the meeting, I hope you don't mind me saying it, just comparing it to the dual language process, where there was a community group that did a lot of work. They recommended future work to be done, and then handed it off to a group of, at that point, primarily staff members, not exclusively, to then take the next steps and bring out to the community and then the committees. And I think that was a good analogy for me to hear, to think about, where we are in a process. And I think we're in a pretty analogous place to the an elementary enrollment working group, producing some really high-quality work and then having lots more work to go. So we'll have more on that soon. Is there anything you want to add on that?
No, I think that's a good summary, and I would agree that it was a really productive meeting. And one of the things, and I apologize, I should have brought the sort of timeline that we worked on and sort of shared there, but one of the things that we did talk about was that the group would come back in February to share that report with the various school committees on that one, so that the expectation isn't that January is the last meeting and then immediately coming into the school committee meetings. But so there is some time planned for the February. So when we get to agenda planning, that's when we'll want to.
Great. And just a quick question for both of you, I guess. At our last meeting, we had talked about putting together a communication plan for the community and for the committee to understand how this is being communicated. And I think we had heard that it was going to be worked out sometime between then and now. Is that the timeline that you're referring to, or is that still in process?
Both.
Okay.
So that was the timeline. It was very high level and sort of focused on milestones, and one of the subgroups within the advisory board is really focused on developing that community engagement and outreach and feedback plan. So they have sort of, and on the website, right? All the artifacts from the group are there. But what they've sort of mapped out is considerations of the different stakeholder groups that recommend that we get feedback from and reactions from, as well as thought starters on ways to do that. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's really much richer than what I'm going to relate right now, but it sort of two kind of phases, and one is really sharing information, all of the information that the advisory board has pulled together, sort of the deep pros and cons, as well as options and ideas for academics and sort of all the considerations and learnings that this group has pulled together, sort of basically trying to create like either a FAQ or some version of the report that will be shared with the school committees, and getting initial reaction. So sort of the first phase of community engagement would be sort of initial reaction given all of this information that we have, and trying to get that broad reach from various and diverse stakeholders. And then the second phase, sort of as Dr. Morris talked about, would be after more work has been done to pull together a more concrete proposal, then re-engaging again to get additional reaction and feedback on that proposal before coming back to school committees for decision. So again, thinking back to how we progressed through the dual language program. The enrollment working group came and prepared a presentation of here's all the things that we learned in the research base and why we think it might be interesting to explore this for our district. Then there was a group that pulled together a more concrete plan, and then the decision went on that concrete plan was made. That's kind of roughly how the flow could go and progress.
Great.
Does that make sense?
That's well stated.
Thank you.
I'm looking at our community member in the audience, and if that accurately reflects it or not. No. So it's all all the artifacts are on the website.
Okay. Thank you.
And the last thing I was going to mention is the town, as many of you know, hosted Capitol listening sessions over the past few weeks. They hosted 4, and they were all, in my opinion, pretty well attended. And what I particularly appreciated is that many of the attendees were not recent or current school parents. And so that's not a demographic that I get to interact with, probably, in my opinion, I'm going to make a qualitative statement, enough in my role. So I really appreciated the opportunity, even though I didn't have much of a speaking role, but just to interact with a demographic in the community that's critically important that I don't often, it's not that never, but don't often interact with. And so it was great to hear where people are and what their thoughts were about all 4 projects, because it was framed around the schools, the DPW, the library, and the fire station. And there were very few questions I was asked to answer, mostly about future enrollment trends, and that seemed to be the one that came up most frequently. But I was able to attend all 4 sessions, and I found them very useful to hear from a different set of stakeholders, or at least somewhat different set of stakeholders than typically come to meetings like this or other events that we host. So I want to thank the town for inviting me to be a listener and quasi-participant, as well as asking me to, do a very 3.5 minute video that was shown at the beginning. But I appreciate the partnership, and I appreciate the town's perspective of looking holistically at the capital needs of the larger community, and we're certainly a critical part of that. And so is the fire, library, and DPW. And I learned a lot, actually, just from my interactions making the video with the other town departments. So I just want to acknowledge and appreciate the town's efforts in that regard.
And I think also this committee was well represented at the
was.
listening sessions, which I know that the town council appreciated, as well as the town manager, but also the staff that I heard from afterwards who were there. We're also very appreciative just to have, as many town government officials there to listen. Right. And very similar to the listening sessions that we held here in this committee earlier this year about the consensus plan for the statement of interest. The town council approached this in a very similar fashion and really was looking to hear, input from the community about these 4 projects that are on the horizon. So, yeah, it was really good. Yeah.
And that's it.
Okay. Any other questions or comments for Dr. Morris about the update? Okay.
Was 2 minutes of time because I accidentally went to the town hall and then I went to the front door and it took like 15 minutes to get here.
Sure, absolutely. We actually had opened and closed public comment. No, and that's okay. We said that we would open it up again if somebody from the public wanted to say something. So I will open public comment again. It's 6:24. You have 3 minutes to speak, and please state your
I
name.
don't think I'll take that. Okay. So I'm Felicia Mednick and I'm part of Mothers Out Front, and we've been thinking about how to work with the town and the schools about electrifying everything, but we're thinking about school buses. And so I put a petition out to encourage the school committee to maybe form a committee to start planning, thinking ahead, what are the issues, like where might we find money, what are some creative ways we could think about it, what might need to be electrified first or last, how does it fit in a whole program. And so at this point, I've got about 320 signatures here that we've started. I'm still getting a few coming into my mailbox, but I thought we just give it to you to show our enthusiasm. And I'd like you to know that if you decide to do anything, we'd love to. We're not experts, but if you ever wanted like some feedback or listening ear or somebody from the community on a committee to help in any way, we'd be more than happy to be supportive in that way. So I want to thank you very much for your interest. And I don't
Thank
know
you.
who to give these
I'll
to.
just take it here. Thank you very much.
Some are from online, some are students.
Okay.
Some are from, if you see like a list somewhere, there, so they're online, so they may still be coming.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Any other public comments since we're back in public comment period? Oh, sure, I'll take that.
I've written on it, but
Thank you.
it was yesterday's, letters ago.
Okay, seeing no other public comments, I will once again close public comments. So moving us along, the next item on the agenda is new and continuing business. First item is the Massachusetts School Building Authority update and discussion. I think this will be no surprise to anybody on this committee and probably anyone watching that on December 11th, the MSBA Board of Directors held their meeting and reviewed our statement of interests. We had an application that we had put in earlier in the spring and decided that they would invite the town of Amherst into their pipeline for Fort River School. And so we have been thinking and talking about this, Dr. Morris and I, just about how we could present this to the committee and how we could, sort of kickstart the conversation. Of course, this has actually been a topic of conversation now for quite some time, not just tonight. So the intent for tonight is really just to have a discussion among the committee about what the thinking currently is for next steps, both for the committee and the community. Things that the MSBA is, sort of going to be in control of for the next few months, and then things that we hopefully can help contribute and help lead with the help of the community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Morris.
Sure, and there's a lot to say, but I'll try to be brief and so it gets a little more conversational, and the slides are in the packet, so I know many people have seen them. Just I want to talk about the good news, the timeline, and next steps, but I want to start by saying that of course I'm very pleased to share the good news about our invitation into the MSBA process, and in particular, I want to thank the school committee. I know, absent the work that you did when we found out last December that we weren't in that process last year, a year ago, if there wasn't work between then and last April when we submitted a statement of interest, we'd be having a very different conversation tonight. And so I do think it's worth acknowledging the work and the work the community engaged in those feedback sessions. MSBA has been very clear about that work was critical to move forward in the process. I also want to say that this is incredibly important from my perspective to improve the learning conditions for students and the work conditions for staff. That there are many issues that this committee will tackle over the next few years. I think of few that have this much impact, few that come up this often as being critical needs of staff as well as community members and students. I think it was last year that the Commissioner of Education came, and Mr. Demling as vice chair and Mr. Donas as chair, and I were able to sit in. And among the first questions they asked the commissioner was, why aren't there walls between our classrooms at Fort River? So it's not just about the adults. The kids are very aware And they understand the message that's sent with the condition of the schools they're in, despite the fact of having great teachers and fantastic education that they receive. There's still a message sent when they're dealing with the conditions they're dealing with, and things haven't gotten better tremendously since that point in time last year. I also want to share that the timeline information may disappoint the community. When I get to that phase, that there's some, I guess, hope maybe is the right word for it, that we get back in, be able to fast track and be done within 2 or 3 years. And that is certainly not the case. And MSBA has been very clear with us about that. And I want to say I appreciate the MSBA, the Massachusetts School Building Authority, as our partner in the planning and the funding of the project. And they consistently state projects take between 5 and 7 years to complete, and they've actually built further safeguards to prevent districts from trying to accelerate projects quicker than that. And this is true for Amherst as it was all other districts, the other 10 districts that were invited in. We all got pretty much the same letter that had some safeguards built in from the MSBA's perspective so that the process can work in the timeline that they think it actually can work, both in terms of the planning and the community engagement. And so today also marks the beginning of a process that'll be long, at times cumbersome, but I hope and expect will result in a betterment for students and staff members in the district. And I remain optimistic that the community can work together to find a solution for the current infrastructure challenges and not live in kind of previous projects and previous tensions. So sorry to say all that before I started, but I just felt like I needed to before I get into more finite details or specific details. So here's this letter's in the packet, but the letter that we received from the MSBA and sort of the exciting part of the letter is that we're invited, just to read it, the MSBA unanimously voted to invite the statement of interest for Fort River Elementary School into the eligibility period. It's not into the full process. The MSBA is meticulous about every step following very detailed directions. Actually, worth noting, the former Inspector General of Massachusetts is on the MSBA board, and he finds this organization to be the finest public organization that he ever has seen in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which I took pretty strongly, but they are very process and detail oriented, and because of that, projects happen and schools get better, right? And there was a precursor to MSBA, and there was cost overruns, it went into debt, there was lots of problems with it. So it existed in its current format for a specific reason, and it functions, in my opinion, very well, as someone who's spent a lot of time with them over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah.
So some of the implications, there were 61 statements of interest received by the MSBA this year, so 18% were accepted. And one thing that's a little different from the last time we were in, for the people who are following this from back in 2013 and 14, is that they have staggered entry dates for districts. We're at the earlier end of that. There's some districts that aren't starting into the eligibility period till the summer, but we are starting on May 1st. So what they do that somewhat for their own staff so that they can balance how many districts are the demand on their staff and better serve districts by not having everyone start at the same time. And also to give districts and towns time to get organized in their work.
Dr. Morris,
Yeah, please.
just a quick pause, if you don't mind.
Oh, please, yeah.
Just to find out if you will take questions from the committee during your presentation, or do you want us to hold for after?
I'm very comfortable taking questions because it's not the longest presentation I've offered you, but it's not the shortest either. So I think questions throughout is comfortable for me.
Okay. Mr. Demling?
Okay, it's just a little one.
Yeah.
So in addition to this staggered, is there anything new about how this whole thing kicks off? Like with we found out on December 11th and it's May 1st. Is that? I don't remember the timeline of the previous project. Like, this seems longer.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different that way. I think most of the other parts of the initial phases are not tremendously changed from 2013. Okay. So also worth noting, the statement of interest for Wildwood School is not accepted into eligibility. Again, this is no surprise. MSBA typically works with one project per district. If you're talking about a large district like Boston or Springfield, sometimes that shifts, but we wouldn't have anticipated both districts, both schools getting in for the same district. And I think it's worth noting that doesn't mean that Wildwood School won't be addressed in this project, or that the Wildwood site won't be looked at as part of this project. It depends on the specific project chosen. And as an example, the consensus plan submitted in the statement of interest last year included addressing both of those schools. And so I think to be seen how that all plays out over time. But I think when Wildwood got rejected, some people perhaps could come to a conclusion that closes the door on Wildwood being dressed as part of this project, and I want to be clear that that's not the case. And actually, even in the MSBA letter, you see they reference the consensus plan as something they know, that they, being the MSBA, knows we'll study.
And I mean, just to put a finer point on it, I think, we took very seriously the consensus plan that was developed earlier in the spring. So it's not just, I think, saying that, that it depends on the specific project chosen. It's actually our preference that the consensus plan be the plan, right, that we end up moving towards. Whether that's a renovation or a brand-new building is a whole other, issue, but we want to take care of both schools simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think I said it in the spring, and I'll say it at the end of the slide deck because it's in there. My personal opinion is I can support a plan that addresses both buildings in the next 7 years. There's a whole lot of variations of what that might look like. To your point, things that we've talked about, perhaps things we haven't, talked about. But I don't want to be 7 years from now with either of these buildings having open classrooms, being inaccessible, all the list of things that we're in. And for me to support it, I think ethically, waiting 10, 15 years is not an option from my perspective.
And that's what we heard the committee and the town council say as well.
So I'll do a little more appreciation. So I already did my appreciation for school committee, got a little ahead of my slides. The town council, I think very similarly, having unanimous vote and an additional letter of direct support was very meaningful for the MSBA. They're very interested in communities, but also in elected officials and their opinions. And so that really made a difference for them. I know that. For staff members, and I'm doing similar these staff outreach sessions, and they continue to work in subpar conditions as a routine condition of their employment. And I just want to say out loud that I deeply appreciate their work despite the circumstances. They do heroic work, in my opinion, given their circumstances, and are incredibly creative of how to make dysfunctional buildings work for students. So the public for engaging with us, last year as we were trying to, under a very tight timeline. I remember we had conversations here about, is it possible to engage the community given the timeline we had? And yet the community was highly engaged in that process. And Amherst Media, I want to give them a plug because they have been consistently not just filming these meetings, but they were critical in the feedback sessions we did last year. So thank you, Jeff and others, for that work. But it's a great medium to get information out, and we're very fortunate to have them as partners. So here's some additional timeline information, and I showed this multiple ways because it's sort of clunky and different learners might like the text or the visual. So I'm going to say the same thing multiple times, but I want to make sure I'm trying to be clear. So it starts May 1st. It involves forming a school building committee. The members are appointed by the town manager, approved by the town council. That's as per the charter. That's not to suggest that the school committee couldn't have, generalized opinions about roles and responsibilities that can be communicated to those bodies. But from a technical sense, that's how the town charter says. We have a responsibility staff on this end to gather information on maintenance and capital planning, completing enrollment projections and certifications. And I also want to be clear about this. This is really the enrollment projections of what we're planning to study. This is not making a decision on, which is going to be the end-all product. But the MSBA, we have our NESDEC enrollment projections. They do some of their own projections, and then staff and the MSBA come up with, what are options for study based on those projections. They're often more conservative, meaning they project lower than districts would like. And if you follow Granby Public Schools, they have a new building, and then they're trying to figure out where their sixth graders, can be educated now, and that's a very common experience. So there's a lot of back and forth and iterative process around that. And then we have to secure local vote authorization for the feasibility study. In other words, we have to fund it. It's worth noting the MSBA will not participate in the funding part of the feasibility study. So that will be on the town's dime, so to speak, to fund it. That's not to say they won't fund the actual project if a project moves forward, but on the feasibility side, that'll be on the town side to fund because we had a previous feasibility study. And this period can last up to 270 days. It certainly can go more quickly than that, but that's how long it can last. Here's their visual from the MSBA website about this. So again, this starts May 1st. A lot of these are, forming the school building committee has to be done within 60 days of May 1st. We'll talk about that a little later. That could be, perhaps done, or at least started earlier than that. online enrollment projection. Again, staff are responsible for producing that, as well as the maintenance documents. And the local authorization of funding has to be completed. And at that point, when all those things are done to the MSBA's liking, and this is going to be a theme tonight, is then it goes to the MSBA Board of Directors, and they choose to either authorize or not an invitation into feasibility. So because we're in eligibility doesn't guarantee that we're in feasibility. And that, if you looked at that letter, they're very clear about that. And so I think there's work we can do, and I'll get to that in a second, before May 1st, or a couple minutes, I should say. But that's the first phase. That's the first, I didn't frame it this way because it's very wordy, but if you look at the MSBA, there's modules, and this is the first module, is the eligibility part.
Mr. Dunling?
On the enrollment certification, is that for the district or for the building?
So, yes. The reason I say that is, we've committed, I think, in the statement of interest, and it's been read that way at MSBA, that we're going to study some level of, not district-wide school, like there'd be one school, but some level of consolidation, perhaps, as a model. So the district-wide enrollment will matter for that particular one. Looking at the current and future enrollment of Fort River will also be something like, because we have to study code upgrade at a minimum anyway. And so you'd be looking at the school-specific enrollment. So that's why my answer, I wasn't trying to be, flip, but yeah, it depends on what you're studying, but the idea is that both, in our case, probably would be part of that enrollment study.
You have a follow-up?
Yeah, and it's to determine a range of projections without specifying how you achieve that, how you implement support. In other words, it doesn't say that you do building X and building Y. It's literally producing a number range. Is that correct?
Not a range, a number.
A number, a
Yeah,
number. Okay.
Yeah, a number.
Okay.
So like last time, for instance, we were looking at, I think it was 360, I want to say, for Wildwood specific, 750 for the plan that ended up moving forward out of feasibility, and then I want to say 670 was the third one that we got added later. But it's not like, between 300 and 400. It's finite, because that's going to drive, when you're doing your study, what the projected enrollment is. It's important to note school choice students are not included in that projection as well.
So these are just Amherst community students. Ms. Spitzer, did you have a question?
That was my question.
Oh,
Got one right.
two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
Look at that.
No, there's a,
Oh.
I think
I
one
feel
more.
like there's like a whammy in front of me. I'm going to press my luck. So there are a number of things we're looking at, right, that could affect the number of students we might want in this building. For example, is sixth grade in the building or not? If all of those decisions that may affect that final number are not done by the time we need this number, how does one approach that?
So I think the way that one approaches it is you try to look at multiple options that are the district's planning to study and get numbers for those. So it's not that you're making a final decision. For instance, on the compromise, we said 600 students. MSBA could look at that, and they could come up with a different number of exactly what was studied prior, because they're going to look at it from a different lens. We'll have 1 year more recently updated enrollment information. So it's trying to say, what do you want to study here? And if you're going to study it, we need to have a finite number of students, or a specific number of students to study it. If you can't give an architect, well, give or take a range of 45 students, they're going to say, no, we need something more specific than that. So it's not making a final decision on a project that is going to be done. It's what is going to be studied, and working with that. And my experience last time, because I was involved in that process last time, was, again, they're going to be a little conservative on their numbers based on their experience across the Commonwealth. And they're also going to look and ask questions to say, are you going to study this? Why aren't you studying that? And it's an iterative process that way. Does that?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
So just this again is copy and pasted from the MSBA template. Unfortunately, it was across 2 pages, so I couldn't make the line breaks work perfectly. But these are the members. So a school building committee member needs to be MCPPO certified. That's someone who has experience with procurement. I don't remember an acronym exactly, but it's someone with a license around procurement. Local chief executive officer, administrator, or manager. So in our case, that'll be the town manager. School committee member, minimum of 1. Superintendent of schools, local official responsible for building maintenance, representative office authorized by law to construct school buildings. So you can see some of these are required roles that involve both town and school staff. School principal is another one. member knowledgeable in education mission and function of facility. Again, that could be an educator. It could also be fulfilled by the school principal and superintendent. So those are, there's decisions to be made in this. Local budget official, a member of local finance committee, members of the community with architecture, engineering, or other construction experience, and other, please provide brief background info or expertise. So this is not a list to exclude people. It's who needs to be included. And then that other category is where the town has to make some decisions on how big it wants the committee to be, what it wants the membership to be, and whether there's other information, I'm not going to say one because I know it, I shouldn't, but there might be some information that, this body might want to pass along, or the town council or town manager might say, we need to have X role on the committee, even if it's not listed as a mandatory, and that's where local decision-making really kicks in.
And just to, I think, comment on that, it seems, that with previous experience that this community has had with previous projects, including other feasibility studies, it's helpful when the school committee can provide guidance on the different roles and responsibilities for the individual members. So the composition, more or less, and you had mentioned earlier that is a function or can be a function of the school committee. The school committee doesn't have the final appointing authority. The town council does, or the town manager does, but the school committee can make recommendations. And so I think that is, a critical thing for this committee to keep in mind as we move forward, right? That we actually can work in tandem with the town manager and the town council to help make those recommendations, and with your guidance as well, Dr. Morris.
Absolutely. And I've talked to the town manager about
Yeah.
this, and I think he'd be very interested in hearing feedback from the committee. Even though the process doesn't necessarily require it, it's a collaboration between town and the schools, and that's the way he wants to keep it, as do I.
Ms. Spitzer?
Just a quick question. So for the school committee member, it says minimum of one. But for all the others, there's no reference to how many. And I'm just looking at, for example, school principal and the potential for this to impact 2 student bodies. Would there be any prohibition against increasing the numbers for any of those, if, for whatever reason we saw it fit to increase it?
No.
Okay, great.
Might make Mr. Yaffe nervous in the back of the
Yeah,
room,
sorry.
but that's a different matter altogether.
No, but it's curious about how much leeway we have.
Yeah, these are like the requirements. Everything above is really open to local interpretation. It's interesting looking at other communities and what they've chosen to do, and what size they've chosen to have. But I'll leave it there, I think.
Yep.
Thank you.
So future timeline information from the MSBA. Projects typically take 5 to 7 years to complete from when they enter eligibility, right? So some of that's based on how quickly the building committee is able to move through its work, and the decision of construction type. Certain construction types will have a different level, different length of duration, and we saw that from the Fort River study, for instance, the Fort River feasibility study that was completed. That actually all 6 options I think had slightly varying amounts of timeline, ranging on from all new to mostly renovation to everything in between. There was a lot of variance there. So given that we're entering the process in spring 2020, the estimate that we have is that a project could be done, the soonest would be fall of 25 into the fall of 27. And in that letter, and maybe I'll read a little more, I took a small excerpt just because of space on a slide, but it's the 3rd paragraph in the letter. Invitation to eligibility period is not an invitation to feasibility study. Moving forward in the MSBA's process requires collaboration with the MSBA, and an invitation to feasibility study will require further vote of the MSBA Board of Directors. It's worth noting, because this is going to come up multiple times in the next 15 minutes, MSBA Board of Directors meets every other month. So even if you feel ready to go in front of them, it's getting on the agenda, and it's not a body like this that meets more regularly. It's every other month. So that also can impact the timeline of things as well. Communities that get, quote unquote, get ahead of the MSBA without MSBA approval will not be eligible for grant funding. Additionally, the town's vote by the Board of Directors approving a potential grant will be no sooner than July 1st, 2022. To qualify for any funding from the MSBA, local communities must follow MSBA statute and regulations, which require MSBA partnership and approval at every step of the process. So that date, July 1st, 2022, what that means is the MSBA will not vote, the board will not vote for what's called project scope and budget, which we'll see a little bit later, talk about a little bit later. That's essentially when they commit that they're going to support financially the project if it's local funding. So that's the earliest date they would do that, which means more likely for districts. And not everyone got the same letter, right? This isn't like an Amherst-specific date. We all got the speech afterwards, after the vote, of because they had info sessions for us, us and the other 10 districts. So that means that a local approval, likely couldn't happen, particularly if there's an override for any community until the fall. Most communities don't like doing override votes or major votes in the summer months because, for some obvious reasons. That's an important date when we get into the overall kind of map of, because we're still sort of where we are right now. Moving forward, that would push a project to most likely 2025 or 2026, depending on construction, because construction itself, the lowest I've seen is 24 months. That was true of the Fort River project. And in between local approval and that is a bunch of design work that has to occur that doesn't happen instantaneously. So that's sort of what the MSBA was very clear with us is, 5 to 7 years. And this July 1st, 2022 date sort of locks everybody into 5 years being the soonest it can occur.
So it feels like this is getting dragged down a lot more slowly, it feels like, than even the previous project, just because of the strict sort of parameters that they've established now for milestones. Right? Is that right? Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, and I think when I get, yes, and I think in a couple minutes when I can go through more detail, in a more detailed way, each step of the process, it's sort of where most districts were anyway, but there's I read that language and then read the oral instructions that Mr. Bacco and I received even more strongly than that they found that districts that try to go too quickly end up coming back for multiple times because their submissions aren't sufficient, and it bogs down not just the process for the districts, but actually the process for MSBA as well.
Thank you. Mr. Demling?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of how to say this in the most time-efficient manner. I'll come back to it at the end, but so two questions. One, so this, other than we got into the MSBA, this July 1, 2022 date sticks out to me as like the biggest, pretty sobering piece of information from this entire update. So could you just, you just talked about it a little bit, but I have to ask the question because I know it's going to be asked of us. How firm do you think, and how firm did the MSBA communicate to you that this date is? Because this date is far later than what many in the community had hoped for, and I certainly had hoped for it to be earlier than July 1, 2022. So that's the first technical question.
They expressed that there was not flexibility with this date, pretty firmly.
Using those words.
I don't remember the exact words, but it wasn't up for discussion. It was made very clear that this is, with the districts who are here, this is the timeline we are going to hold to. There's a whole bunch of reasons that I share. There's also, from a cash flow perspective, having some predictability from the MSBA point of view of when projects are going to come up. That was expressed to us as well. But it wasn't, there wasn't questions that seemed appropriate to ask after they orally went over this detail.
The language in the letter seems pretty clear.
Yes, yeah.
Mr. Demling?
And then could you then explain and if it's in a later slide, that's fine. Why? So after the MSBA say they approved it sometime in July, why 3 years before a new building? I think understand why, but I think it's really important for the community to understand why that is, because it sort of feels. If you don't get into these details, it feels like, well, we got it approved. Why don't we have the building, the next year?
Yep. I'll get into that in a little bit. Okay. So here we are. So I think this slide is when I can get into it. So if you think of eligibility, I went over that before. We have 270 days for that. Forming the project team, that typically takes, if you look at other projects, anywhere from 5 to 8 months. So what that is that hiring an owner project manager. So that has to be a formal process as per state procurement where you put out for bid, you get multiple proposals. There's a team that ranks those proposals. There's formal interview process, a formal ranking process. An owner project manager is hired. Then there's contract negotiations with that owner project manager. So that takes a while. That owner project manager then contributes to the hiring of the design team or the architect or designer. That process follows a similar trajectory with the variation that decision is actually made by the MSBA's designer selection panel. So there are 3 members locally who get to participate in that and vote. And there's, I believe, 12 members in the MSBA's designer selection panel. So it's not even just the timeline of the posting and interviewing. It's actually that the final interviews are at MSBA, has to be scheduled when the designer selection team is available. There's other districts vying to get on the same timeline,
And just to clarify, the MSBA is the one who actually makes the final decision about the architect, right? That
so they have
gets
12
used.
votes of 15,
Yeah.
and the local participants have
So they
3.
basically get the vote, yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully those align, and most of the time they do, from my understanding, but not always. It did last time. And so that process, I think people can compare it to like, oh, you have a problem at your house. How do you find someone? State procurement law, and then that additional step of needing to schedule at MSBA takes a while, and it's a critically important time. You want to get this right. We want to get this right. So the idea of rushing a process or not getting bids because you're trying to have a too tight timeline of how long the RFQs are out, right? It's first of all, state procurement law would prevent it, but even coming up with the RFQ and being really clear on what the expectations are. I mean, I think of the OPM. Let's just start with that one because that one we own. Completely around communication, there's going to be high demands on that, and thinking through what does an RFQ look like. There is some standard ones in the MSBA, that they provide for you, but that there may be some particular questions and attributes that we're looking for locally. So that takes longer than people perhaps want. I mean, I looked at a couple other districts, and that was the typical range, 5 to 8 months for that phase. The feasibility study, and the reason, just for people to know, if you can't follow it, the blue is for districts. This is right from the MSBA website. I didn't create this chart. The blue is for districts, and the orange is where you're relying on construction professionals. And the reason that's split is the district hires the OPM. The OPM helps with the process to hire the design team. The feasibility study involves multiple reports that have to be submitted to the MSBA and approved, and that's an iterative process in of itself. Every time you submit, you're going to get feedback that needs to be responded to. It's never just like, yep, you submitted it and it's checked off. So that involves a preliminary design program, which is a multiple 100-page document, an educational plan, which, as you may know, is reviewed and approved by the school committee, and a preferred schematic report, which takes all that and finds that's where you go from multiple things being studied to one preferred design. All those have to be presented or submitted, and then in the case of the latter, presented to the MSBA, including sometimes to subcommittees of the MSBA. For their review, they'll offer feedback. Revisions have to be made. And this phase ends with the approval from the MSBA Board of Directors to enter schematic design phase. Looking at other elementary districts, the average I've seen, and I haven't taken all of them and averaged them, but you see the neighborhood of a year. Some go a little quicker. There's one example I looked at that was like more a year and a half. I hope we can, again, expedite. We have a lot of existing information, but we're gonna have a designer that's gonna be taking all this in, and we're looking at things that we have a lot of information about, and it still needs to be communicated to the community, and that community input piece is huge in that process. Then we get into schematic design. If the MSBA Board of Directors votes to to allow us to enter it. This typically is shorter than feasibility. It's more 4 to 8 months. I should say all these phases, especially getting to feasibility, have a lot of community forums, community feedback, as well as the work of the building committee. So that this is shorter, looks like 4 to 8 months more typically. This district and design team, again, comes up with a final design program, and it's much more detailed than the feasibility study. This involves, work with direct work with staff and stakeholders to understand best, exactly what's needed in a special needs room that works with students on the autism spectrum, right? When we're at the feasibility level, we have some idea. When we're getting to schematic, there's direct staff contact around those issues. That phase also includes a submission to DESE, so the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has to approve things. They're looking often at special education, but also other items as well. And at that point is when the project scope and budget would go to the MSBA. So when it gets to funding the project, that's their end of funding the project. So if you add up that timeline, that brings us to 2022. If we're starting in May of 2020, sorry. Sounds like Back to the Future 2020, but I'll get over it hopefully in the next 2 weeks. And so that timeline sounds, really far, but the amount of work that happens between when the process starts and there is significant. And from MSBA's perspective, and I agree with them, as desperate as I am for new buildings and for better environments, doing that work and bringing the community along with that work and doing that work right is incredibly important. And no matter how much information we have, it's still designing a building that we hope gets built. And it's not like stock ones, we're just gonna take this and do it exactly the same. And so again, that's where we can't get into where it's just funding the project, we can't get beyond, earlier than July 1st, 2022. At that point, the town, in this case, the town of Amherst, would have, potentially a town council vote and potentially an override, although that's up to the town council how they choose to fund the project. That's not mine, it's my guesstimate from what I've heard from the town. And this gets to Peter's question, Mr. Demling's question. So let's say that all happens in fall of 2022. You then have this thing called detailed design. So what that is, the district gets the design much more finite, because at that point, they're giving it to construction professionals who need to take that and understand what it's gonna look like, where the, buttressing support is gonna be, not roughly where it's gonna be, down to the, minute detail. It's also where generating construction documentation is, related to that. Procure bid, so if you looked at the newspaper yesterday, today, you saw East Hampton secure its construction bid. That's a lengthy process. They had a very favorable bid, so I'm very happy for that community. But that's where, all the bids are going out, and there's a procurement process with that, and a construction contract is done. So that generally, when looking at districts, it can really vary depending on the construction type, but 6 to 8 months is what I've seen as typical. Again, you're gonna see some outliers within that, but that's what's typical. And then you get into construction. And again, for this project, I would expect, based on our prior project that was based at Wildwood, as well as the Fort River feasibility study, that there'd be a 2 to 3 year construction phase. Construction meaning shovel in the ground construction. And I checked this with an local architect to make sure I wasn't wildly off on my estimate, just because we haven't actually built this building, and they felt that anything less than 2 years was not reasonable, given the climate, given the winter months, someone who builds locally. And then the last thing is completing the project, and that's closeout. That typically takes a year, and that's a final audit, and they audit both the financials, but also to make sure that all the systems are working the way they should work, that the energy efficiency that is promised as required, to get like energy credits, 2%, that it's functioning, commissioning, and all that work is actually happening. So if you include that last phase, we're looking at 6 to 8 years. I'm not including it because my vantage point is when are kids and adults in a different building than they're in now, or at least a different feeling building if it's literally, a renovation project in the same building, but it doesn't feel like the same building. So that's sort of the timeline, and that's how you get to 2025. Again, these are broad estimates. You see lots of districts take quite a bit longer, looking at one that Wellesley, for instance, their timeline's quite a bit longer. You see some that may be able to be as quick as this, but with that 2022 July safeguard in place, it sort of ensures that all of us will take 5 years. I say all of us, like the 11 of us, because now we're bonded together. It did feel that way, actually. They did a nice job of that. There's a lot of information.
Let's keep moving, 'cause
Yeah.
there's still a lot more.
Yeah, this is more or less a summary.
Ms. McDonald, do you have a?
Just one clarification. So what so if I hear you correctly, between Module 7 and Module 8 would be occupancy of the new building?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and what you'll see a lot is some districts occupy the building before the old building is knocked down, because that's gonna have to happen in the summer, and they can't get both of those things done. So that first year the new building's open, the old building may just, like if it's a new construction, it may still be on the property, and the next summer it comes down. Not that that happens all the time, but I know a couple projects where that was the case, that there's so much focus on getting the new building ready that demolition can't happen, obviously, while kids are near the property, and that happens perhaps the next year.
Got it, thanks.
I'm actually going to skip this slide. It's in the slide deck, and it really restates a lot of what I just said in a simplified format, and just because I know I'm taking a while. So.
And I just very quickly want to highlight again, for members of the community or anyone who wants to take a look at the packet afterwards, that the superintendent has been referring to this document, which has a listing of different modules, and this is from the MSBA directly, just in terms of typical projects. So it's a good reference for timeline.
Yep, and I added some of the timeline information from my experience, but I actually stole it from another district who edited it from the MSBA timeline, so.
Nicely done, Dr. Morris.
Yeah, but I'll own my stealing. And so what action steps can be taken in the near future? So for us in this group, the district will be creating a project website. It should be up and ready to go before the 1st of January. We don't have that many relevant documents. We don't have videos quite yet. But information, because even while we're, not in the eligibility process, we want to get that going so that people have one-stop shopping that they can start relying on as more information becomes available. We're starting a process, started this afternoon actually, at Fort River, of informing staff of the implications of the invitation of feasibility. We know there's a lot of good information out there and perhaps some confusion. We'll be at Wildwood tomorrow and Crocker Farm after the break. Excuse me. So we'll, I imagine we'll continue to have this topic on agendas. Look to publish articles in the media about the MSBA process and complete a window into ARPS about the MSBA process. Again, the more accurate information, we can get out, the better. And we want to develop models of ensuring staff engagement, and that's some of the feedback I got today at Fort River. Continue to get at Crocker Farm and Wildwood, even for staff members who are not going to be on a building project. What's their interface with the work, and what are the logical places for us to gather staff input more regularly as part of the process? So I got some really excellent feedback today at the Fort. For the town council, town manager, right, they, while there's feedback certainly can be given, they have to organize a process of school building committee selection. One of the things that's come to me is the Energy and Climate Committee, which is a subcommittee, I believe it's a subcommittee of the town council. They made 3 recommendations last month that were adopted by the town council, and something that I am deeply interested in knowing is what do they believe the implications for this project to be. I'll be candid to say it's not a topic I'm going to wade into. I feel like my perspective is we need direction from the town council, and I'd love to have it before the project starts, of what are the implications. I've seen the text of what they voted, and I think I need to know, and I think my personal opinion is we need to know before we get going, in a pretty clear way, what are the implications for this project. I'd rather not study options that are actually in conflict with what the town council has adopted, and I want to make sure that we're knowing what that is. And they have to figure out a way to fund the feasibility study, and the final date for that by the map is January 26, 2021, although certainly I would hope that happens sooner. That's just, I think it's 270 days from May 1st. I think that's the math of it. If the website I used to calculate that's correct, then that's what it is. So the cost of feasibility studies, the MSBA gave us data. This is all the elementary school data they gave us from 2018 and 2019. And you can see the range from Wellesley at $2.5 million, and the lowest is Swampscott at $750,000, and Groton Dunstable. I think there's some hope that we could be on the lower end of this cost because we have a lot of great information about the site, both sites at Wildwood and Fort River. So I'm glad those studies were completed, even though they didn't result in a new building. But there's still architects, there's still design fees, there's still community meetings and engagement that we need OPMs and designers to do. So they gave us this data, so I'm just presenting. This is literally all the elementary schools in the last 2 years that they gave us, and what the feasibility study costs. That's a conversation for the town council that the town manager would have. Town manager has indicated it'd be helpful if I came to the town council and talked some of these matters through in January, and I told them I'd be happy to do it.
That's great.
I'll keep, obviously, the committee updated as well if that meeting is to occur. So one final note that I would be remiss if I didn't harp on, which is that significant capital needs exist at Fort River and Wildwood. So, for instance, at Fort River, when we had the snow and then it melted with the rain last week maybe, it's hard to know, keep the snow and rain in my head. The areas of the library, which have been highly problematic at Fort River, and we did a lot of patching this summer, held. There was no drainage problems. However, new areas emerged that were highly problematic. And so I use that as an example of, at best case, these buildings are going to be in operation for the next 5 years. And I think there's going to be some really hard calculus on both the school committee's part, my part, as well as the town, of what are items that we can't wait on in resolving? What are things that we can't just assume that these buildings are going to be rebuilt? We have no guarantees on that. We have experience with having no guarantees on that. And, I'll say if the community decides that Wildwood is not addressed in the next 5 to 7 years, that's going to be a really different matrix for capital needs at that school. Again, I want to repeat what I said. I'm not going to support projects that don't involve taking care of Wildwood. There's a myriad of ways to do that. Again, some that we've talked about, some that we haven't. My personal belief is in the next 7 years that no student should be at the current buildings, and I'll repeat something I said last year, because actually someone in our central office community, their family had a baby last week, and I got to see a really cute picture, and it reminded me that to imagine that child not being in a different structure by the time that baby graduates. It's hard for me to fathom. And so I've been clear about that last year. I'm going to be clear about that now. I'll be clear about that in the future. Again, there's a myriad of ways to do it. I'm not trying to lock anyone in, but to a specific plan at this point. But I don't think I could support a proposal or a project where in 2027 both buildings aren't either renovated or new. So if you're interested in these modules, like this handout that I put together, put together small parts of, the MSBA website has a really helpful page around building modules. And again, I just want to finish by saying this is really exciting news, and it's also a bit sobering, to use Mr. Demling's term, about the timeline. And that's the feedback I received from Fort River staff this afternoon was great, and wow, 2025 is a ways away, and that's the best case scenario. And that last slide, or the second to last slide about capital needs, is certainly on the front and center of staff members' minds and community members' minds as well. The vast majority of students in our elementary schools right now will never see, and maybe even none of them will ever see, they will see, but they will not be students in these schools. And so that's a sad reflection, but our staff members, certainly we hope many of them will be. And so we want to make sure that we're engaging that community and supporting them, because it matters.
Yeah. So I want to thank you, Dr. Morris, for putting together such a thorough and complete presentation on the information coming from the MSBA, but also next steps for all of us, for this committee and for the community to consider as we move forward. For me, that's been one of the most important pieces of all of this, is communicating as soon as we can the different steps involved, because I think on the one hand, there's a lot of excitement about being accepted into the pipeline. And then, as we saw with the previous project, there's a lot of opportunity here for, just confusion, misinformation. And we want to make sure that people are on the same page from the get-go around this project, and that we have the ability to bring people along with us and provide opportunities throughout for their input, and so that they're a part of this process. A couple of points that I just wanted to make. One is, I think the capital needs piece jumps out for me quite starkly. And again, given the current conditions of our buildings, we've heard a lot during the past couple of years about how both Fort River and Wildwood are experiencing, these really severe infrastructure problems throughout the year, both from failing HVAC systems, the extreme hot, extreme cold in certain classrooms, to the failing roofs and all of that. And so it does bring to me, this is an urgent need for us to take care of. And unfortunately, again, a lot of these things will be sunk costs, quite frankly. I think, we'll try to mitigate that. This community will try to mitigate that to make sure that we're not throwing away money. But at the same time, we still have hundreds of students. We have, hundreds of employees that are in these buildings day in and day out. We have to provide for their safety and their well-being during the time that it will take to hopefully be able to get a final building project approved and funded and built. So I just want to stress for this committee, and I think for the community, that's something that we need to absolutely stay on top of, is just, making sure that we're working in concert with the JCPC, that we're working in concert with the town council, and that we have a plan of action. And I know that you've put together already a prioritized list for all of those different projects. And we'll need to continue looking at those and examining them and just making sure what makes sense during the next few years, even as we move forward on this. And I think it's extremely important for us to just keep pounding on that as much as we possibly can, because we don't want people to assume that because we're going to be building a new building or renovating one of these buildings, that we should not take care of these other buildings. That's absolutely not the case. And then I also wanted to just stress that it's great to see that part of your plan involves putting together a communications plan and having a website that's dedicated to this, future project that will get populated with content and with other things as the project evolves. I think we want to make sure that that website is very clear and easy to find and easy to navigate, and that we're constantly, putting in the information that is both shared here in this committee, but that is also shared out publicly, any information that's coming from the MSBA, because I think that, again, the confusion that comes from these projects of this magnitude can make it really difficult if we don't have a place where people are familiar with, and that they don't know that they can go there for, for constant information. And then the last thing I was going to say was just, on media, utilizing our local media, publishing an opinion piece. We've done that in the past. I think it actually makes sense, given that this just came through, this decision from the MSBA, for us to send something before the end of this year and request that the Gazette publish it, the Bulletin publish it. And perhaps it can be from myself and you, Dr. Morris, sort of the joint thing from the committee. But it's just a matter of getting it in sooner rather than later so that we can share this information in some format with the public, let them know that this has been discussed and here's what to expect during the next few months, and then kind of kick off the process for the community to begin discussions and, just get us started with that. So anyway, I just want to open it up for the rest of the committee as well, but wanted to make those comments while they were fresh in my mind. So I'm going to go around, this is a big deal, so I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to say if anything that's on their mind, and if you don't, feel free to.
Well, your comments covered probably a lot of the things that I was thinking myself as going over the agenda this weekend and this morning. So I'm not sure I would add very much. I think one of I just would double down though on the website and getting that up as soon as possible, getting the information on the timeline and the steps front and center, and setting up a plan for sort of how that regular communication is going to happen. I've seen there's so many models. You and I were looking at some from other, we don't have to be recreating the wheel, so to speak, in terms of models of what works and doesn't work. I would also encourage, some of them I've even seen sort of having their own sort of social media channels as well, that I think can really help, because people don't naturally think to go look at the, at the website and know where it is. I don't, geeks among us are probably going to bookmark that page, but not everybody will. And if it's possible to have that information available when you publish, or have the Gazette publish that, because then that's an opportunity to sort of say, and all of this information is right there when we sort of get that attention. At this point, I don't think I have anything more to add. You've said a lot.
Thank you.
Well, a few things I wanted to add. So I think one of the things, and this isn't a criticism because I haven't seen this done here at all, but one of the things last time that happened was that people talked about the Wildwood project, and I think because all of us are committed to addressing the issues at both Wildwood and Fort River in the next 5 to 7 years, I think when we're talking about this communication piece, it's going to be really important to, as much as possible, avoid calling it the Fort River project, or find a language that isn't clear that anybody, if they're a parent at Wildwood, Fort River, I'd even say anywhere in the community, they should be paying attention to what's going on, and so that nobody feels like at the last minute we're changing the scope or our commitment to the project. So the other thing is, I was thinking what would be helpful is, as I'm going through this module, I almost feel like we want to create something like this with a date column, and I know this is just a suggestion, and also a column for how we can have the community engaged. So I was looking at this and just trying to think of where are folks going to be able to get involved, and trying to make it as clear and as frequent as possible. And think about it. It looks like you want to say something, so Dr.
I
Morris.
do. So I struggle with that. I even struggled with whether it was a good idea to present this tonight, frankly. Because I know that there's going to be exception projects that, taking the project team took 4 months, and somewhere took 10 months. And I think when we get the owner project manager on board, they will be in charge of running that part of the project. So I think we could sort of scope out modules 1 and 2 perhaps. And once it gets beyond module 2, there's going to be a lot of factors that are, frankly, beyond our control. And that's why we have an owner project manager to do that.
So are these dates on the letter not necessary? So they don't necessarily line up with the.
So the dates on the letter
I'm sorry,
are.
I'm just getting.
No.
I mean, if I'm having an issue with this,
No,
then
this is
other people are
exactly-
going to
Yeah,
be having an
absolutely.
issue with this, and
Yeah.
so.
So the dates on the letter are the due dates. It's not that those dates can't happen sooner than the dates on the letter.
Okay, so maybe
So-
like a,
So that's, I think, where
Yeah.
we struggle is like you could take the maximum amount of time for lots of these phases, and I think I would endeavor that we don't take the maximum amount of time under any phase, and I think that's where it gets complicated. So for me, it's trying to think of module 1 and module 2, and maybe we can see with the town, because a lot of these things aren't actually connected to, not everything in modules 1 and 2 are connected to school committee or
Yeah.
district, and trying to see if we could put something together and then really push on the owner project manager once they're hired halfway through phase 2 to lay out. I think MSBA's guidance was anytime you put out a specific calendar, the one guarantee you have is you won't be on that calendar within 6 months, and people will tell you that you're not on pace, and that's not actually the nature of this process. So I think it gets to the conflict between wanting to give information and not wanting to commit because we don't have all the factors at play.
Sure.
And so they express a very strong caution about putting numbers out too soon when we get into the process, and then putting dates out, because they said you could put a date out and you need us to approve, like even the end of this eligibility, we could do everything we want to do, and then they could say, you're not there, right? We don't accept this, and we're not going to push you forward. You have to get on their board date, and they really don't want us to presume that we're going to be on their board dates at a certain time. So I think that's the challenge.
so would you feel comfortable adding some ideas about the community, like leaving the date piece aside, more fleshing out? Because there's so many people in town who are interested in this topic
That's
and are
right.
going to want to be involved. Not everybody who's interested is going to want to participate or even be able to participate
Right.
on the school building
Right.
committee. So for me, and this doesn't need to be done now, and we may be the ones, or the town manager might be the ones, or the school committee,
Right.
the school building committee might be the ones, but I think getting a clear pathways, there's passive engagement, which is going to the website and,
Right.
and learning about the project. And I hope that at a minimum, anybody who's interested will do that. But I think we're going to have a lot more folks who are wanting to be more engaged and starting as early as we can to plan out how to do that in a meaningful way. So it's not just passively getting the information, but being able to create an email address where people can go, that's unique rather than just, I don't know, I'm thinking brainstorming right
Yeah.
here, but I think we want to start on that piece as early as possible.
Can I make a suggestion?
Please.
So I think that there's going to be a lot of ideas like that are great ideas, and I'm wondering if maybe for the next meeting, that can be part of the agenda as well, is just to have a conversation
Yeah.
about some of the tools by which to engage the community, because then that would be a fantastic
Right.
thing to also share back, is to say, here are all the different things that we have available, whether it's, an email address,
Right.
website, social media, profiles, all of those different things. That provides a way of engagement, to your point.
Yeah, and I
Dr.
think just
Morris.
adding to Mr. Adonis's comment would be also who the "we" is, right? So you have the school committee, you have the town council, you have the school building committee, and so that, again, I don't want to sound too cautious. I don't disagree with anything you said. I want to be really clear about that, but I also don't want to have questions go to the wrong body. And I think being really clear on what are school committee topics, what are school building committee topics, what are town council topics, is going to be something that we're going to have to work out over the next couple months.
So maybe that's something for you to bring to the committee
Yeah.
for the next meeting, Dr. Morris. Ms. McDonald, you wanted to make
Yeah,
a
it
comment
was,
on?
it was just, because I agree about the dates, that it's helpful, and I understand the caution about putting a specific date on there, but I wonder if we could sort of show, you, instead of saying what our dates would be, have a column and say, here's what Acton Boxborough had, and sort of, this is what the time it took, and the specific dates for them, and give maybe, at least 2 different examples to show, help people understand. And then obviously, this, we know this date is May 1st and this date is January 26th. And after that, we don't know, but then people can at least see different pathways that different towns have gone through this.
I think
And
that's a
that
great
might
idea.
get at sort of what we're trying to get at, which is that, that it's 5 to 7 years before we get to the end.
I think, Dr. Morris, if maybe you can work with Ms. McDonald and Ms. Spitzer, just to bounce ideas off for some to bring back. That's not, that's not a quorum there. And we can have that conversation and then bring it back to the committee for the following meeting.
Could I ask just one more question?
please.
Question that was, so I'm also thinking about, maybe this is too much in the weeds, but thinking about how, if Fort River is the project that got studied, just answering the question about, we have a new program there, the dual language program, and that is changing the enrollment, increasing it at each year incrementally. So the kindergarten and the first grade. So would that be something that they will take into consideration when we're coming up with our enrollment numbers?
Yeah, this topic came up when Ms. Adonis and I met with the MSBA when they did their site visit. They were actually very interested and curious and chose to walk through the dual language room, I think partially because they were, for the reasons I just mentioned. But they're aware that that is impacting our enrollment, and then we'll continue to do that by the time this building would be completed. So the short answer is yes, and we've actively had that conversation already with the MSBA.
Mr. Demling, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Yes. So, so just to clear the desk of pretty much +1 everything everybody has already said. I do think the committee has some learned experience about building and or feasibility committee composition and selection. We went, you probably remember, Mr. Jones, we went really deep on that for a number of months when Ms. Hazard was chairing the committee. So I bet you we could probably pull some of the minutes there, and just in terms of like sharing, what worked, what lessons learned, and you were, Dr. Morris, on the previous building committee. So I think between those two things, providing that knowledge to the town manager would probably be assist. Just to reemphasize 2 points that have already been made, the communication coordination challenge of which body do you ask, that's going to be more than a 2-month thing. That's going to be this entire project thing, because it's just off the top of my head. Possible Crocker Farm expansion, change of enrollment zones and communication of that, 6th grade to the middle school, all these things that are in the purview and clearly the wheelhouse school committee that relate to the building committee, and so that's going to be a constant challenge. Mr. Jennings' first point about the capital, there will be no easy decisions about that. I mean, we'll do the best we can. We'll have the best process. But how do you tell a parent of a disabled kindergartner who's going to be in these buildings for the next 6 years that it's wasted money to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars to make their facility ADA accessible? There is no easy answer to those things, and we're gonna have to make those decisions, and so we're just gonna struggle with it. Now those are kind of lower level, higher level. It is, I think, what you referenced earlier, a tempered enthusiasm that I'm feeling right now. I mean, yes, I am happy that we're in, and I don't want to undervalue the importance of this milestone. We worked hard to get here. We haven't had a financial path forward for almost 3 years. We've just been hoping, and now we have a real path forward. And also, in my opinion, one that we should expect to succeed. I think, to the community's credit, I think there is broad awareness and understanding and acceptance of the educational urgency to replace the buildings, of the need to do it in a financially responsible way, and the need to compromise so that it's not as combative as it was last time. So I think that's a really strong foundation, and we should feel confident that will pass. That being said, that July 2022 earliest approval date is a real reality check, I think, for the community, and it has, in my mind, 2 really large implications. One is that we've hoped for acceleration for years. We've hoped that maybe because we've had a previous project, we have a lot of information from that. Maybe because we did the Fort River feasibility study, that MSBA would afford us some kind of schedule contraction, some sort of fast tracking, and that's dead. That hope is officially dead as of now, and that's hard. That's hard to accept, that it's going to be this long. And the other thing that it really drives home for me is how untenable the possibility of doing back-to-back MSBA projects is. Because if you play out the calendar and you project that the earliest that you could possibly get the statement of interest in for Wildwood would be 2026, and I'm not even sure if closeout that you could do that, but let's say that. And if you go on the same schedule, then you're talking about finishing and opening Wildwood in 2032. At 2032, right? So yes, of course we'll study it if the MSBA requires us studying only doing Fort River, because if there's one thing we should know and learn from this process is that if we want MSBA's money, we're going to have to play by their rules. But there's no way to justify a plan that kicks Wildwood to 2032 or beyond. And so I struggle a little bit with how to communicate that to the community because it may be a technical requirement for us to study it. But just personally, as an elected official, there's absolutely no way that I can support that. So, you know, I'm confident that this project will eventually pass. I'm looking forward to getting started, and I do think it's going to feel awesome when it's done. And you know, where the kids are running around with glasses of Kool-Aid or orange juice or whatever, and everybody's happy with the success. But I find the timeline a new and sobering reality to try and acclimate to right now.
Thank you, Mr. Demling. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask if there's no further comments. I know we can talk about this the entire night long. I don't know if there's anything else, sort of last minute, you know, note or comment that you want to make, Dr. Morris.
So I just think the brief conversation about naming convention, I'll just say this to the committee and the community. If someone has good ideas for that, I will acknowledge my failings in naming conventions more generally. So if people have thoughts about it, let me know. I think it's important to what Carrie said is it is clear in terms of its communication. My ability to solve that problem is quite limited. So any ideas or suggestions are welcome for the committee or the community. So I just wanted to highlight that point and not let it go because I do think how the project gets the naming convention that's used from the beginning, it'll stick. Whatever it is, we know it'll stick. And so I encourage, I'll crowdsource that one for whoever's watching on TV as well, morrism@arps.org, and please send them my way.
Ms. Spitzer.
Just one clarifying question to get back to Mr. Demling's point about timing, both for me and for the community. Is it possible for us to submit a statement of interest for Wildwood while we are in the pipeline but while we're in the process with Fort River?
It is. We did that when we were in the process the last time. You know, for districts our size, you know, we've been told, you know, that it's unlikely to yield a result. But certainly we could, and that's something the committee could certainly talk about this winter. And I think it's a good conversation to have. We had it, you know, with the last project. I think most of the years we were in that project, we submitted, as I recall, submitted statements of interest for Fort River.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I believe that's true. I'm looking at
I believe that's true as well, yeah. I think there might have been like 1 or 2 years that we did not. Okay, thank you, Dr. Morris, again. I think this was a really productive conversation. I look forward to seeing from across the aisle the follow-up to this. And to Mr. Demling's point, we'll probably be here to make public comment as well. So, okay, so moving us on to the next item on the agenda, budget guidance review, the early childhood access report.
So our window's closed a bit for
Okay.
the person who is presenting that, who's a consultant. So we didn't have it first because of the other topic, but I was getting text from her. I apologize for looking at my phone that something came up and her window was shorter than she perceived it would be. So
Do we need to table that discussion?
we do need to table that discussion
Okay.
until January. She said she'll be open to doing that, and that time I think things will be less fresh on this topic, so we can put that first and have
Okay.
it more marked. So she
That's too bad.
apologized,
I
but
had a
something.
few comments on that report.
I know, and I really wanted you to, I mean, because
Yeah.
it's not anything about Mr. Ordonez. Well, no, that's not true. Mr. Ordonez is the only one who's not going to be back in January in this role, but also has been an advocate for early childhood education since she first got on the committee. So I'm sorry, but there was no way
Another
to
reason to come
juxtapose
back.
that.
That's- Okay, so we will table that discussion for January
Yeah.
with the committee's permission. And I see nodding heads. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is dual language enrollment process. And I see Ms. Richardson here. Thank you very much for your patience.
It's on loud because of the potential, or the childhood was going to be done remotely, so. I turned the volume off. I don't think we're planning on using it, to my knowledge.
Is it okay if I sit here?
Yep.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
The only problem is we need a mic on you, because otherwise we can't hear you, yeah. We might be able to move perhaps the public comments one, or Mike, are you going to sit there, or?
Is it okay if I share that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello. Thanks
Hello.
for having me. So We're here to just revisit the enrollment policy for the dual language program. So I've shared in the slides kind of the overview. I can quickly run through that with a few comments and then just open for your input and conversation. So we included a link to the current enrollment policy there. Okay.
So.
And just to review, the intention has been that we have 40 seats in the program, about 20 in each class. And the target is to have a balance of Spanish speakers and English speakers with a lottery in the spring to fill as many of the seats in those groups as we can, except for the need to maintain some seats for Spanish speakers coming in later in the process. A review of the enrollment groups are listed there. So our 4 enrollment groups are first our Fort River zone Spanish speakers and bilingual students and families, and then second would be our Spanish speakers zoned in other areas of the district, followed by English speakers at Fort River, and then English speakers at Crocker Farm and Wildwood zones. We did include in the policy last year that the sibling preference would be that siblings coming into the program would receive priority within that group, so whichever group the family fell into to begin with. So this was just a timeline of how that went last year. So we asked for information on the enrollment forms, both through the home language survey and the bilingual continuum. The enrollment team met and looked at those and slotted folks into a group, and then there was a lottery process. These are the current numbers that we have in the program, though we have 2 new Spanish speakers coming in recently, which is exciting. So it's great to see that our students who are coming to us new to the district from other places are able to have the opportunity to join in here, which is both great for them and for the program. Overall, I'd say the implementation went really smoothly in terms of the lottery process. There were not a whole lot of bumps in the road, less so than I maybe would have guessed at this time last year. So we had most of our seats filled. We did maintain some seats over the summer that were filled. The biggest bump, as you all know about, was as we saw a decline through the loss of a few students in August. We had requested permission to accept school choice students who had already been accepted and were Spanish speakers. 2 of the 3 that we offered seats did take us up on that offer. So the feedback from the staff working in the program and from myself on that point is that that has been really beneficial, both for those students to have that opportunity as well as to increase the number of Spanish speakers in the program.
That's great.
So the 2 pieces that come to mind, there may be others for you, but the ones that I posted here were just the ones that I think I've heard the most conversation around. One being that school choice policy, and one being the sibling policy. I've spoken to some parents of current students who have really, just asked for us to think about that further because they might, I think some of the trickiest ones are when they have a child coming into the program in group 4, which is the least likely to be guaranteed a seat going forward. That if they have a younger sibling, they'd really like the sibling to go into the program as well. I do believe that it's really important to maintain the balance of Spanish and English speakers. The only question I guess I have, and maybe there are other ways of looking at that I haven't considered, but the only question from where I'm sitting is the question of would you ever want to have a student in group 4 sibling priority over a student in group 3? Other than that, I'm not sure how else we could really deal with that question, but I know that that's been a real concern. We've spoken with some families about that, so I think it's worth raising here. And I guess another thing, I don't know if we talked about it last year, but the other part of that question, I guess, would be that if a student isn't guaranteed enrollment in the dual language program, could they go to Fort River? So that's a question as well.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. So say the older sibling is in the dual language program. They're zone or group 4. So they're not zoned for Fort River. if the younger sibling does not get a lottery seat into the dual language program, could they at least attend the same school by going to Fort River?
Okay.
So that
Yep.
seems like a valid question as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Morris?
So I think we're having this conversation, thank you, in December. Thanks, Ms. Richardson. We're having this conversation in December because we want to actually, in the next 2 months, probably by, my opinion, by the end of February, be communicating what the policy will be. I'm using lowercase p policy. I'm not talking about
Right.
school committee policy. I mean, one could write a policy on this, but we haven't historically done that. So that we can communicate accurately to families. So kind of a timeline of this conversation I can imagine is Ms. Richardson and I received feedback tonight. We come with a more concrete proposal based on that feedback in January for the committee to review, get questions about, and the community also could weigh in on. And then we would sort of get the final go-ahead in February so that we can be communicating to families ahead of our enrollment period, which generally, March is where it really, starts heating up. So that's why, one might wonder why we're talking about this, seems like a slow time to talk about enrollment, but it's actually to give the committee and the community enough time to weigh particularly these items that are, still feel like we're looking for school committee input, craft something, make adjustments perhaps to what was presented last year, and then publish in February, after the February Amherst School Committee meeting. So that's sort of the kind of flow as we saw it, as how we could go from here to kind of concretizing this work moving forward.
Great, thank you both. So I'm going to open it up to the committee now to see if there's any questions, comments, explorations that you'd like to pursue with either Ms. Richardson or Dr. Morris.
Can you go back and show the numbers for each group? Yes. Please?
Sure.
Yeah.
And is this as of today, or
I did this on,
has there been any change that went to these numbers in the last week or two?
there is one, possibly two more Spanish speakers.
Coming, right?
One, possibly two more Spanish speakers. I forget if I did this before or after
I think
one
it's
of them had
before.
come, but.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just wanted to make
That's
sure.
okay. Yep.
Ms. McDonald, did you have a specific question, or?
I didn't have a question, I just said.
Oh,
wanted
just
to
for that,
review
okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there's other questions.
Mr. Demling?
Chair, Ms. Spitzer had her
Ms.
hand.
Okay. Sorry. Following up on the numbers question. So are we talking about 2 new students who were in group 1 or 2? In terms of, do you know if they're zoned?
One of the new students is definitely group 2. The other, I believe, is group 1, but I am not positive.
I mean, I guess so we might be at 17 or 18 Spanish-speaking students now. Have you seen any, I'm just wondering, I feel like because you can join the Spanish-speaking program at any point in time, those are the numbers that might be going up, but we may see a decline over time in the English-speaking students. Is that, is there any indication that anybody who's currently in the program is thinking about moving for?
There's no indication at this time, but I think that's correct to think about, that, if circumstances change for a family and they need to move, that would, there is the potential to lose English speakers over time, whereas there's the potential to gain Spanish speakers over time.
Right.
So I think that's true.
And
Sorry, just to,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
thing I think, just thinking about the balance in the program too, is that while we've sort of taken a simplified view of looking at Spanish speakers and English speakers, it's, as we've talked about, it's really much more complex. And so those who are, even though I don't like the term dominant Spanish speakers, there is really a range. And so within that Spanish-speaking group, we see some that are much more comfortable in English and some that are much more comfortable in Spanish. So there's a range within that. So that's important to consider in terms of balancing the population in the program as well.
Right. I guess my question is thinking about the sibling policy and how it intersects with potentially the school choice policy, and also how it intersects with our policies with regards to student with special education plans that may take them outside of their district that's zoned, and how we're treating the siblings of students in that type of situation, because it's the closest analogy. So I guess
Yeah.
with this, I could just see like a school choice student with a sibling who is there a preference already in the school choice program for for siblings to end up in the Amherst district? And could we end up prioritizing a sibling of a school choice student over a Crocker Farm or Wildwood group 4 person, I guess is.
So
Sorry, this is kind of getting in the weeds, but these are the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, so I can answer, I think both parts, of definitely the first part. So the way school choice works is the only prioritization we can do is sibling. So siblings can get in, they go to the top of the list in their grade level band. It actually works very similar to what we're talking about here. So
Okay.
it's not that they're, within students who are applying for kindergarten, students who have siblings in the district have a lottery. They're at the top, let's say there's 6 of them. They have a lottery within to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then school choice students at that grade level who don't have a sibling are 7 through however many there are, and they have their own sort of lottery. So it does function in the way that you described, that that's the only preference we can offer, or we are required to offer, I should say, but I think both are true. So I think that gets to the question about choice and whether we would want to prioritize choice students who have Spanish language background versus siblings in group 4, and I think that's what we're looking for feedback on, but that could happen depending on what feedback we receive from the committee about choice. And I think this it's really hard, and I think Ms. Richardson presented sort of an interesting option before about, could they go to the school and perhaps not be in the program, but at least it eliminates the need for, it's a hard choice to make, because for the benefit of the program and who the program, it was designed for all students, but that's one of these kind of like general statements, but we were really looking at the educational debt. When we were doing it and wanting to maintain a 50-50 program was our priority, or as close as we could, and we're pretty close. If you think of how many total Spanish speakers there are in the school district, it's our number in Caminantes +1. Which we're not going to do much better than that. So I think that's where the rub is, so to speak, is that there's compelling arguments that we made both ways, and how do you maintain the programmatic integrity while also not having kids go to perhaps different elementary schools if it can be avoided? And again, that's the feedback we're looking for. Do you want to add to that, or?
Yeah,
You're welcome. so you don't
I
have
guess I think, if I'm understanding correctly how we're thinking about this, right, is that we would never, because they're separate groups, we wouldn't be bumping anyone out from group 4 that would have gotten a seat by allowing a sibling of a school choice Spanish speaker, because we're trying to maintain those seats, right?
For Spanish speakers,
Yes. So I don't think, if we didn't have, school choice, I think would only be considered in the case that we weren't already full on the Spanish speaking side. I don't anticipate a situation where we would have any space in the English-speaking side. I think we're always going to fill that with our students up to the capacity that we feel comfortable with Amherst students, right? Because we know we had a wait list this year, right? So, does that make sense? So I don't know. I think that gets part of the question that
I guess
you were asking.
it gets into whether or not, but the school choice policy was one that we did for 1 year.
Right,
And so
exactly.
if we were to, they're just interconnected. 'Cause
Exactly,
If we ended
they
up
are.
moving forward, because we can make the decision not to continue the school choice policy, or we could make the decision to continue it. And if we could make
And
the
what does it
decision
look like if we
to
do?
continue the school choice policy, I guess that's the thing that maybe we should communicate with the folks on the waiting list who are English speaking, is that they're separate.
Right.
Because some people perceive it potentially that if we are allowing school choice students in who are Spanish speakers and we're capping the English speaking, that they're not actually competing for the same seats. Because I think there might
Yes,
be.
that's what I'm
I,
trying
I think this is the problem, because you can look at it as though they are competing from the same seats if you look at it as a total pool of the number of seats.
Yes.
Or you can look at it like, no, actually these are only available if you have a background in Spanish, and these are only available if you don't have that background. And I think that I know for some people in the community
Yes.
don't view it that way.
Yes.
And so maybe it's about our communication about it, as a way of improving that as we move forward, or, and it's just, I think it's
Yeah.
important to be transparent and keep reiterating that point then, because I think it can be viewed as the other way.
Yes.
So I'm going to go to Mr. Demling and then Ms. McDonald.
Sure, so I appreciate that this is not an easy problem. It's not an obvious solution here because we're trying to be fair to all groups. And so the kind of principles that I start from in order to try and then get to the details are, we set this program up obviously because it benefits all the students who are in it. But, we've said time and again that one of the main drivers is that this is one of the strongest, most evidence-based ways to close the achievement gap for Spanish-speaking English language learners. And so, I one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about allowing the Spanish speaker school choice students in earlier this year is that I can't imagine those students being a part of our district, having school choice in, knowing that the program that's going to most benefit them to close their potential achievement gap is right there, and then we don't let them in because they don't reside within the bounds of the town. So I feel like in my personal feeling is that at the very least, we need a group 2B Spanish speakers who are school choice, in terms of that flow. The only question in my mind is should they have equal access to those who are in Crocker Farm and Wildwood? I think you could make then the case that some people might move here or live here with the expectation of the potential of getting into this program, even if you're not in Fort River, right? And so you hope you're in the Crocker zone. It's not a guarantee, but you're hoping you get in there. You might feel like you've been given a false expectation if then school choice is equally so that's the argument I could see with dropping down the school choice Spanish speakers below group 2. You make group 2B. But I do just feel like they should be in there. So the other, and then that's the other principle that drives my thinking here is trying to be consistent with the expectations that we've already set for parents. So I'm glad. I think it was Ms. Spitzer brought up or maybe it's Ms. McDonald, the analogy of the special ed siblings. So today we have a situation where families need to send their child out of an enrollment zone and they can't send their sibling there, right? And so we've already set, and that's a very hard, problematic expectation that we've talked about a lot on this committee, relates to buildings and whatnot. I would find it pretty difficult to allow the exception for a sibling of an opt-in program when we haven't solved it for this other situation. But that being said, I think we could also add a group 4B for maybe we'll never get to it with the wait list, but English speakers who are school choice. Who want to be in the program, but so I would like to find a way to weave that in, those school choice students.
Ms. McDonald?
Yeah, so earlier I was asking if we were just taking questions, so I didn't realize we were moving on to comments, but it wasn't just what the numbers are.
It sort of bled into, yeah.
Yeah, but, definitely, plus one, what I was going to say was, similar to what Mr. Demling just related, which is I would have a real challenge, like seeing us accepting siblings of particularly the group 4 when we don't have a solution for students and families that are need to send their students to specialized programs out of their zone. So, yes, that's a requirement versus an opt-in. I think that's a big part of it. And it's not to say we shouldn't do that. It's just we need to be consistent across all of them. So if we want to entertain that, then let's develop a policy also for the other programs as well, so that families are kept whole regardless of what program that they're in, which might be the ideal. I don't know, I'm not knowing all the consequences of that. I don't want to go on the record of saying, let's do it. But I do think consistency is important in that. And I also, regarding the school choice, because not only is the educational sort of philosophy on this is about closing gaps for the English language learners, but also just that it works best when you have that balance, and that's critically important. So I think having school choice Spanish speaking or Spanish, a group 2A or 2B is going to be important, not just for those students that are choicing in, but also for the success of this program on an ongoing basis. So if we haven't filled all of our Spanish group 1 and group 2, or Spanish speaking seats with group 1 and group 2, and their siblings that are choicing in, in that sort of Spanish-speaking group, then it makes sense to me to have a policy that enables them to join. I don't see it the same way for the English-speaking seats, because I think we're never going to have an issue filling those seats just from our own population.
And just to jump in, I think I agree with that, and I feel that, well, first of all, let me take a step back. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for being here again and walking us through all of this. Really appreciate it. I think, and I have no questions, actually. I think everything was presented very clearly. My only thing is just a comment that I think, I would be comfortable accommodating siblings if we are sure that there are no other Spanish speakers that would be taking those slots. And that's a difficult balance, I think, to try to, get to, right? Because there is a question of timing for enrollment. When, notices go out initially, I think families are waiting to see, where their students are going to go, of course, right? At the same time, I think that given the value that we've placed and that we've agreed now over the course of 2 years during these conversations about establishing this program, that it is extremely important for us to have a balance of Spanish speakers, whether they are fully fluent or not, but just to have that balance there for the success of the program, including the success of the English speakers who are learning the Spanish. If that balance doesn't exist, then the language assimilation is just, and the cultural assimilation and all the other benefits that we've talked about, is diminished. So I think, for those reasons, I would want to explore a little bit more, and I think it's worth probably bringing this back to the committee to have another follow-up conversation. But I do think it's worth exploring, and thinking about the value that we've currently established in the program, and how we want that to continue. And I think the stability and the continuation, at the same time, is also extremely important. So I don't know that makes anything easier, both for the committee and for the work that's going on with the program, but it's definitely, a sticky problem for us to consider and to talk about and to think about. Dr. Morris, is there anything that you wanted to add to this, or?
Very briefly, I think that gives us what we need to craft something. Look at last year's enrollment policy and kind of, and that was done before we had this choice conversation in the summer, and bring a revised draft for the committee to consider. I'm looking at Ms. Richardson to make sure she agrees. It's okay if you don't, but I think so. And just, I want to just highlight, in case people in the community aren't familiar with it, educational debt, and it's not to suggest that that's a word that anyone else should use, but it's, having, this actually really connects to our next agenda item, it's a term that Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's connected to MSAN and a professor at the University of Wisconsin, has used to kind of shift the connotation of achievement differences between groups. And I think in this particular instance, one reason I feel strongly, and I know Ms. Richardson does as well, about prioritizing Spanish-speaking students is if you look at the experience of Spanish-speaking students or students who don't speak English in general, and their achievement, not just in Amherst or in Massachusetts, but across the country, it's one of the groups that has been historically underserved. And we see the results, not just in the school district, but the results in terms of life expectancy, future income. And so for me, the reason the term applies well in this situation is that I feel like we do have educational debt for those families and those students, and this isn't the only way that we can work on our debt as an organization that's existed for a long time, but it is a tangible one. And it's one that's very real, and I'm not trying to pit sides or create that dynamic. But you look at our, both locally and then statewide, you look at the performance of Spanish-speaking ELL students, and clearly there's a need for a different model for that students starting in grade kindergarten. And we've applied. We'll find out hopefully soon. My calls went unanswered today and Monday. We applied for another grant similar to one we got last year. Knock on wood, we'll see if it works out. But I think the state is truly recognizing, I think the title of the grant it's a funny title. It's like Alternative ELL Approaches. But I think the state is recognizing, based on research, that what we've historically done was not bad, and it was with the best of intentions, and it didn't always address the learning needs of those students. And so I think that's when you hear, Ms. Richardson and I know not everyone agrees in the community, and that's the way it works, democracy. But the reason you hear us advocating so much around kind of this choice student and to have the balance, it is absolutely, as the chair said, to benefit the whole program and the model, but it's larger than that. It's really about what are we providing for students, and what debt do we offer these families and these students? Because historically, we haven't made right on our collective commitments to that population. And this is a way we can start changing that dynamic. So sorry for that long-winded explanation, but if that's a term that was unfamiliar, I wanted to share my thoughts about it, not only as a kind of, people might say, oh, it's politically correct, but hearing Ms. Ladson-Billings a couple weeks ago talk about it really informed my thinking about how to talk about this topic. So, sorry.
I prefer educational debt to achievement gap.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two things that we're talking about here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you again for bringing this to our attention. I think the only last thing that I'll say is somebody had mentioned at some point about writing a formal policy, because we don't, or had mentioned that we don't have a formal policy about this. I think we should move towards that. At some point, it'll help.
Yes.
Once the program is established, it'll help families and the community feel more, secure and comfortable with the decisions that are being made. And so, we're kind of feeling our way right now, and we've had great conversations during the past couple of years about establishing this program and the goals and all of that. But I think having something on paper, sooner rather than later makes a lot of sense. So something to think about for the future. Great, thank you.
So Donis is certainly getting 3 minutes of public comments ready for the next couple of meetings. I'm very impressed.
I'm making my
Lining them
list.
up.
Yeah.
3 minutes, 10 seconds, maybe. We'll think about it.
I don't know, I'll wield my gavel.
Moving along. So the next item on the agenda is Minority Student Achievement Network. So this is a discussion to share updates from MSAN about enhanced options for elementary districts to engage with the network. And Dr. Morris has already alluded to that, so I will let you take it from here.
Yeah, and this will be, I think, a relatively brief item. But MSAN is, just to back up, it's a network of 20 some odd districts across the country who typically are suburban communities. There's not a lot of truly urban communities within MSAN, but have high levels and varying levels within the network. It's not everyone's the same, of racial diversity in the student population. Oftentimes there's also socioeconomic diversity in other parts, but that's the core is about racial ethnic diversity. And you may hear of it or think of it most of the community, I believe, thinks of it as the high school students who go to a conference every fall. They'll likely come to a regional meeting next month. And it's a fantastic student experience for students. They make an action plan and then execute it when they come back. And it's an incredibly meaningful experience every year for students. And so the other part of MSAN, so we had our 20-year anniversary, which I updated the committee on at the regional meeting recently. The other part of MSAN is that it's supposed to be a professional learning network for the educators who work there. And I think historically, and I'll own part of my last 3.5 years, is we've really focused on the student aspect and perhaps less on the adult learning aspect of the network. And so they had their 20th anniversary, which you knew, and that agenda was shared with you for that session, those sessions with you at the regional meeting. And it's a couple things that have happened is, as a network, it was never intended only to be a 9 through 12 network, but there's multiple, membership is mostly constant, but it's grown a bit over the last few years. And there's a couple elementary only districts that have joined the network. So very much like this district, except the sending district doesn't always necessarily part of it. In the Midwest, there's a lot of these split districts, as I'm learning. And most of the network, or the majority of the network right now, is located in the Midwest. And so at the conference, one of the things that I was sort of enlightened about was a renewed focus to maintain that elementary schools matter in terms of MSAN, that it's not just about the high school student experience, it's not just about the high school adult experience, and that was really reflected in the conversations that we had. And I think it's articulated that every year MSAN has a site visit. So it goes to a particular district. All members are, districts are welcomed in the network. And they do a site visit to a district. They walk through classrooms and have discussions about what they're seeing from an equity lens. And this year it's in February. It's in Oak Park, which is an elementary district outside of Chicago. that actually has their school committee has just adopted an equity policy, lengthy equity policy, and that actually is driving their school and district improvement plans, and a lot of similar threads to things we've talked about in our district. But it really enlightened me, and perhaps getting more directly connected to MSAN again from the adult learning, the educator learning perspective. One of the districts that I spoke to that's based in Wisconsin actually had their school, and I'm not asking for this tonight, so I want to be really clear, but was sort of in a similar boat as us a couple of years ago, where the student experience was at the core of our connection to MSAN. But it wasn't, one of the things that someone used to say here was that, they wanted people to feel like card-carrying members of MSAN. Everyone in the community and everyone in the, all educators. I would not say that's the case here, and they actually had a school, and their state is called school board, vote a renewed commitment to MSAN and the work. And so I'm feeling, that this is something we want to keep coming back to, and not just at the regional level, because we haven't talked about MSAN in my time going to school committee meetings, which is probably 6 years, and maybe I missed it, but we haven't talked about it at the elementary level. And it's a really important network, and the policy that's written, particularly because this one district is an elementary only district, it is an equity policy for an elementary school district, a larger district than us, but nonetheless. And so, we are considering whether to bring some folks to Oak Park in February to run an equity protocol walk in the school. And it's hard because of the distance and the cost, which is not super significant because MSAN does work with us, and the hotels are inexpensive, because they get a rate. But I do think it's one of the items that I wanted to, maybe introduce tonight and continue to come back to with this body, is how do we not forget that MSAN applies to this district as well, and that if we're expecting the secondary schools to work on equity more formally, and the elementary schools aren't part of that. I know that's like hyperbole, but that we're not actively having discussions like we just had about equity. I think that's inaccurate, and I want to make sure that we're injecting conversations about MSAN and equity at the pre-K to 6 level as well. So sorry, this is more soliloquy discussion, which wasn't what I was hoping for, but I have talked to the elementary principals who are highly interested in engaging in MSAN. Actually, MSAN is something that is, even among our leadership team, thought of as a secondary level item. And as MSAN has shifted, I think there's an opportunity for us to shift along with it and really have more K-12 conversations that are inclusive of the methodologies and best practices that MSAN's focus on, because really at its origin, which some of the founders of MSAN were at this conference, last thing I'll say, I promise, at its origin was districts, this is pre-No Child Left Behind, pre-standardized tests being disaggregated. There were these districts, ours included, who said, we know we're not doing right by all students. And yes, there wasn't on DESE's website evidence of that, or other states. And so that commitment came from a place of not just the student conference being the solution, but actually that a collective group of districts who had similar focuses, some similarities in demographics, but most importantly, a similar commitment to make their school districts work for every child, that there was collective wisdom in that, and that it wasn't easy to find that locally for a lot of the districts who were involved. So I'll stop talking, and again, I apologize for the length of that, but I wanted to provide a context for why this is on an Amherst Elementary School Committee agenda.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. I think MSAN is clearly valuable, and I think we've heard you mention it quite a bit, both at the regional level and sort of in passing here. Through the years, and so absolutely understand the reasons and the context for bringing this conversation. I'm wondering, so I have one question, a couple questions, I guess. One is, you mentioned conference and you mentioned sending staff to that conference. Obviously, there would be a cost associated with that. In addition to any events that they might have, is there any other additional membership cost or anything like that that the district would have to consider?
So that's already paid for in the budget and has been since its inception, 20 years ago, that there's a membership fee that's already been budgeted for and continues to be. That is split between Amherst and Region, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And my second and last question actually is, how do you see bringing back the benefits from MSAN to the district in a practical way? Is it, professional staff development? Is it materials and resources that people, are exposed to? If you can just maybe describe that a little bit.
Yeah, I think in Amherst, part of it's being located in a relatively rural part of the state, without tremendous number of peers in our locality, we don't often get to have conversations with other districts of how they've approached similar problems. Northampton's a good example of something that we have a really strong a district we have a really strong relationship to. There's some similarities between us and Northampton that help. And it's not that we can't learn from districts that don't have similar demographics or philosophy, but it's a different conversation. And it's not that there aren't urban districts that we have a lot to learn from. But again, there are different considerations that are part of it. And for me, what I got from the conference I went to recently was really in-depth conferences, and some of it were general, some of it were job-alike, where they had superintendents having those conversations that were particularly meaningful because the context is different. And I think sometimes when, even getting outside Massachusetts, when there's different state rules and laws, it's fascinating. This came up, I don't think this is an aside, when we were looking at dual language programming in the lottery. So remember when we came up, there was a school district in MSAN in Arizona, and there's like wildly different rules about lotteries and how people can get in. And because of that, they have a really different perspective on things. And that conversation was really generative for me in thinking about, I never realized there could be that limitation, and how do you get around that? And those are the kind of conversations, I don't want to make it sound vague or hokey, but it's if we're going to improve what we're doing for students, we want to get the best resources. And some of that might be physical resources, like we did with the math program review, where we looked at MSAN districts and what math curricula they use. But some of it's also that we're all working on this educational debt challenge and looking at different approaches. And this district has a very fresh, their equity policy was approved might have been in this calendar year, actually, that's ending. And why did they create a policy? We don't have an explicit, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, but we don't have an explicit equity policy. What led to that creation, and what are the results of that, and how is that informing things on the ground? Right, those conversations open our eyes and get us out of our local environment, which I think is really beneficial for the work moving forward.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the committee? Ms. Spitzer?
I would just like to offer my support. I think it sounds like a great idea.
Okay,
Thumbs up from Mr. Demling.
thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Morris. I think bringing it up formally like this, I certainly appreciate that. I think I appreciate seeing your thinking around these kinds of things, and I continue to look for opportunities for us to have more equity conversations that affect both our students and our educators. And I think, yes, we've been very active on discussing issues related to equity at the regional level, middle school and the high school.
Yeah.
I look forward to having it brought to the elementary school level.
Yeah, absolutely. As do our principals, because I want to give them a shout out. They're hungry for this and learning from other districts, and they're having those conversations, but they don't necessarily come to the public in the same way they do at the regional level.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving us on to
There was a hand up, I'm sorry.
Mr. Demling, I'm
I
sorry.
just a short thought. That one thing that just occurred to me is, with the focusing it on the elementary district, I think sometimes we see issues of equity manifest more at the later years because students are older, and so that it becomes more obvious. But when you talk about this term educational debt, if you don't take we all know in our own lives, you don't take care of your debt, it grows. Right?
That's right.
And then it becomes unmanageable, and then it takes over all the other investments you can make. And so if that can be paid off in the earlier years, and when we know this with reading intervention, all sorts of things, it is a really interesting thing to see if we could proactively shine a sharper spotlight on where our attention needs to be before things manifest and our attention is demanded.
Yeah, fully agree.
Thank you, Mr. Demling. Okay, so moving us on to warrant review process. So this is a conversation that we started at our last meeting. And this is basically just an update on where we are with sort of the warrant review approval process, because now that we unanimously voted for the entire committee to approve the warrants and to have a report that we vote on, we just wanted to bring that back to the committee and sort of share our progress and update you on that. Dr. Morris?
Yeah, so I think just one concern that Mr. Mangano expressed that I want to just share is that warrants generally need to get approved in this district. Since this committee meets once a month, that probably is too lengthy a timeline between warrants being approved. So I think there was no opposition to the method chosen, but one idea he had for your consideration would be, you know, if there is a regional meeting, could this body meet 5 or 10 minutes before one more time a month? It would be a formal scheduled Amherst School Committee meeting to take care of that, because I think he's worried about vendors getting paid on time and actually staff members, because payroll warrants. So none of that is to suggest that the decision you made was there was any opposition to. It's more just, how do we get the logistics to work for the decision to be executed in a way where people still get paid?
And so, Dr. Morris, I mean, I think, I saw some nodding heads. I think that absolutely makes sense. I'm wondering what that practically would look like. So we're looking at adding a 5 to 10 minute, a brief meeting, basically, of the Amherst School Committee before a regional school committee to be calendared at some point. It would have only one item on the agenda, and that would be the approval of the warrants. So I'm assuming then that this committee would see the report that is going to be voted on in advance. Is that correct?
It would be, yeah, absolutely. The same
Okay.
as if it is twice a month, Mr. Mangano feels like that would be sufficient. So it could operate the same way that that the committee was thinking of for what would happen at an Amherst School Committee meeting.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I see nodding heads. Mr. Demling, do you have a question, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it is consistent with what we were talking about at the previous meeting. I don't want to pretend like scheduling and posting and running and calling and showing up for an additional meeting is nothing. I mean, it is going to be an additional administrative, logistical thing for everyone to take care of, but I can't right now think of a better solution, so I think it's probably best.
And if it really is just a one-item agenda, we're looking at, 15 minutes before, and not necessarily every regional meeting, so we just need a quorum, basically. Okay,
Yeah, so we can start implementing that in January.
sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Morris.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is school committee stipends. Excuse me. Also, an item that was on our previous agenda, and that we discussed quite a bit regarding school committee stipends, which were identified by the new town charter. And this is a conversation that we had at the regional level when a policy came up for review that was brought to the school committee, the Amherst School Committee level for discussion. And the question previously was the Amherst School Committee would be drawing the stipends as approved by the town charter. In this year, it's actually from the school's budget, and that was set last year. And so that money has been sitting, basically waiting for the school committee to draw from. In the upcoming year, I wanted to share with the committee, so I had a good conversation both with Dr. Morris and then also with our town manager. Ms. Spitzer came because she also had raised some concerns before about the budget. And it was a really good conversation, I think, with the town manager, just about how we could consider this, the question of which budget this is coming from in the future. And he was actually very supportive of shifting this from the school committee, from the school's budget to the town's budget. The argument that we presented and talked about was that there are stipends that are coming not just for school committee, but also for the town council, and there's other expenses that the town incurs as a result of the work that the charter had identified previously. And these are existing line items in other budgets. But what we're talking about is pulling them out of their respective budgets and putting them in their own separate place, both for easier tracking and then also so it doesn't feel like we're pitting, school committee against the school's budget or, any of the other budgets in town. So again, I think, town manager was very supportive of this. He's bringing this to the town council. I had mentioned to him that I would be discussing this with the committee in public tonight, and he was supportive of that. So I take that as a commitment that moving forward, that we will be able to see this coming from a different budget. And I'm very, thankful and grateful for both Dr. Morris and for the town manager for listening to that concern and willing to creatively, come up with a solution that would address that. We certainly do not want to put our school committee members in a position where they have to say no to a stipend that the town voted on and that the community voted for. And also put people in a position where they, if they need the money, they should be able to use it, right? I think we've all incurred expenses, both childcare, gas, all sorts of different things. this is a job that is being performed, and, for those reasons, the stipends were put into the town's budget, and the town charter, because in recognition, I believe, of the time and resources that are spent serving on these committees and on these boards. These are not very large stipends. They're, $3,000 per school committee member, $4,000 for the chair, and that is just for the course of the year. So it's not something that anyone could live off of. And that was not the intent. It was really just in recognition of, the costs, again, that are incurred as part of the service. So, but with that, I just wanted to bring that back to the committee, see if there were any additional comments, or questions about this. And then I believe, I don't know, Dr. Morris, if you have any further updates on where we are with the stipends from this year. But first, maybe some questions or comments
yeah.
from the committee.
Yeah.
Mr. Demling?
I really appreciate you and Ms. Pitzer taking the initiative to meet with the town manager and loop in the superintendent, and I appreciate them hearing us, and thank you for making the concerns known. I think this is a great outcome.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Ms. Pitzer?
I also just wanted to echo my thanks to everybody for listening and being receptive to our feedback, because I just want to reiterate that I think stipends are important because I think they help to hopefully over time create more inclusivity and to enable more people to serve, because it is costly in different types of ways to actually serve on a school committee or on town council, and I think we need to recognize that, and hopefully by offering stipends, it'll encourage more people to consider taking on the role. So my objection was never to the stipends. It was more to just try to find a way to make it so that we weren't pitting the school's budget needs against the school committee stipends.
Yeah. And just a very quick anecdote, I think, to help drive some of this home. When I was going through the union negotiation contracts, there were periods of times where we were meeting in the afternoons, sort of, soon after school ended and before my partner, my husband, was off of work, and we didn't have childcare, and there were so many meetings that I couldn't afford to pay for my kids to be taken care of while, I was representing the school committee and negotiating these contracts. And so I brought my kids with me, and I think because these were educators that we were meeting with, and we had a separate room for them to sit in quietly and, read books and, but these were 2.5, 3 hour meeting, that my kids were sitting through while I was going through the negotiations. And that's just the reality of serving on these committees. I think, I know I personally am grateful for the opportunity to have served on this committee, but it doesn't come without a cost. And so, again, this is in recognition of that. And I really appreciate the fact that we're having this conversation. So, Ms. McDonald?
Not for tonight, but I think, as we move forward, I pose just question in my mind, because our terms are calendar years as opposed to fiscal years, and yet we budget on a fiscal perspective. So, just like reconciling that and sort of understanding sort of what that looks like in terms of timing and proration and all of that. Like, I don't think that we didn't cover that in the policy because we hadn't really gotten that far into it, but I do think that that's something that we need to sort of, regardless of which budget it sits in.
Yeah. Dr. Morris?
Yeah, I think, so it was budgeted for, it was added to the budget last year, as you remember. So in terms of that, that's in place. I think to your point, it's going to sound really impersonal, but the cost is the same because it will be prorated, the cost is the same regardless of.
Right.
If someone gets part of a year, they get, from a budgetary perspective, it doesn't really matter, right? Because it's not like one person comes in higher on the salary scale like it would be for teachers, and you might have to make an adjustment that's a flat fee. But I think there is some logistics with the business office, certainly for people getting paid this year, that's been clear. But I think as we get, not next year, but the year after, where there's a potential where there would be, we'll work that part out. I'll just leave, I don't think it's logistical, and I think we'll get in the weeds. But in terms of the funding, we added that to the budget for this year's budget. So we're in fine shape with that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving us on to the next item, the school committee calendar agenda items. So this is, again, as a reminder for the community and for the committee, sort of a running tally, if you will, of agenda items for the school committee. And so we're looking at January and onward for 2020.
So we'll reorganize. My short opportunity to get the gavel. And then we'll have the initial budget projections, and we'll also have a capital plan discussion at that point in time to be where we need to be for JCPC. We could certainly move the school choice form down because we're going to have a number of items, and it's not going to make a big difference. But we put it there as a placeholder. But other years we've done it during the budget forum, so that which is February, which sometimes the budget hearing, and that sometimes has a nice feel to it. We'll potentially have a fee. Actually, that fee vote should be incorrect. It should say fee report, and then the fee vote would be in February. Sorry, we wouldn't ask you to vote. So report in January and vote in February. Mm-hmm. We'll come back to the dual language question as we talked about. I think at that point we'll have a sixth grade report, and now that, I think I agree with Ms. McDonald that this is probably a sixth grade update, and maybe that's in superintendent update, knowing that the larger presentation will be in February. Because I think our last meeting is the 13th, and I just don't see us pulling together in the 8-day period between those two and then we talked about perhaps garden program, and capital plan is listed twice. I don't know why. But we'll have to come back for Crocker Farm School Improvement Plan, which is, as you saw in the packet that was scheduled for last night, that's done, ready to go. The Family Center also wasn't able to come tonight. And then I'm going to add the early childhood report. So what I think I'll do is perhaps Ms. Ordonez's last act in the role of chair is maybe we can, even just sort of draft something before you're done, so that we could figure out how to right size January and February, because right now it seems lopsided.
Yeah.
If you're willing to do that in your last in your final weeks of your tenure, just being that there'll be a reorganization, I could certainly do it with the vice chair as well. I mean, whatever makes sense for both of you. However you want to work it out, I'm happy to work with whoever.
We can
on that.
talk offline and try to
Yeah.
figure that out. Thank you. Okay, so at the end of the day, January is very full. And are there any other items or topics of discussion that the committee would like to see added to either January, February, or any of the other months? Mr. Demling?
So this has been more of an issue at Region, but that's a continuing discussion. But lunch balance forgiveness implementation method. I don't know how to say it any better than that. As I look at the gifts that we have tonight, it strikes me that we may want to discuss that at the Amherst level.
Maybe you want to combine that with the new food services director meeting as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sounds good.
And just clearing out the notes from the MSBA discussion, and this is maybe, depending on how the MSBA schedule goes, maybe more of a February or even March, but maybe February, just school building committee input guidance discussion. School committee can talk about to what degree it wants to formally or informally provide input or feedback on the school building committee composition and selection process to the town manager.
Yep.
Ms. Spitzer and then Ms.
My
McDonald?
comment was just that now that we are in the MSBA process, I'm wondering if that shouldn't just be a standing item
Yeah.
for every month.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe specifics added as we go. But
Mm-hmm.
Ms. McDonald?
And this applies to multiple districts, not just our own, but we had canceled a budget sort of review and meeting, like deep dive. And so I see that we have the projections in January, a hearing in February, and a vote in March. And so it's feeling like we need to sort of look at scheduling that in January at some point, probably potentially after the 21st. So I don't know, I can't remember if that originated with the region and that, okay, so.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay,
Okay.
packed agendas. All right, so next item on the agenda is accepting gifts. Does anybody want to make a motion? We do have gifts. Ms. McDonald.
I move that we, that the Amherst, that we accept the following gifts from Lucia Spiro, BNY Mellon Pershing, number 4025134625, to support Crocker Farm at the principal's discretion in the amount of $800. From Mary Ames and David Dodwell, number 282, for lunch balance forgiveness at Crocker Farm in the amount of $500. From Box Program, to support donation of 50 soccer balls to the Before School Program, estimated value of $900, for a total amount of $1,300.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Spitzer. Any comments, questions? Dr. Morris?
As I do every year, because she makes a gift every year, Lucia Spiro was a longtime ELL teacher in the district at both Fort River and Crocker Farm. I had the good fortune to work with her at both of those sites, and she continues to be actively involved, including attending listening sessions that we had last year. And I just want to personally thank Ms. Spiro for her continued support of the Amherst Public Schools after a career of supporting students in the Amherst Public Schools. So thank you, Lucia.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Ms. Spiro. And thank you to all of our donors. So we have a motion. It's been seconded. All those in favor? And it is unanimous. Okay, so before we move on to the last and final agenda item, I just wanted to take a moment to also give my thanks to this committee and to Dr. Morris for the honor of working with you. This has been such an incredibly life-changing moment, an experience.
Not tonight, the whole thing.
The whole thing, yes. And a moment in my life, but it's, the experience of serving on the committee and serving this community. I came to Amherst just a few years ago, and as Dr. Morris has mentioned before, and I think most of you know, have worked in early childhood education, working with nonprofit organizations for a number of years, but I had never served in public office before. I didn't know Amherst very well, and I thought, this felt like a good match, both for my skills and also just an opportunity to really set roots and work on something that I cared very deeply about. And so I've been absolutely eternally grateful for that opportunity. When my first campaign checks came through, I cried because I couldn't believe that anybody would, donate money to my campaign that way. And it was, it was just, it felt like an embrace almost, And so it hasn't always been easy, of course, serving, I think this is a wonderful community that has a lot of passion and deep opinions about a lot of things. And so do I. So, I think it actually has worked out that it was a good match and it was something that I could, devote myself to. So I am going to miss this a lot. I don't know what I'm going to do with all my free time. But thank you, all of you. I really, really appreciate you, appreciate getting to know you better, getting to work so closely with you. And I'm looking forward to sitting on that other side in the future.
Unfiltered.
Unfiltered. Right. Yeah. So with that, I will take a motion.
I move to adjourn.
So we have a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning?
Michael, let it happen.
3 in favor?
Oh, fine.
4 in favor. It is unanimous. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Yeah.